Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D in WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the second part of What If Deku Couldn't Feel the Pain. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku was expecting Aizawa to scold him after he returned, but the pro hero did nothing of the sort. When he slipped through the door into the announcer's booth halfway through the next match after Todoroki's, Aizawa only spared him a single glance. To be completely fair, the two heroes were busy giving commentary on the matches, but either way, Izuku was grateful. He had no desire to be interrogated again. He was already so sure that one friend was slowly slipping away. He didn't want to lose another. He was too late to watch Todoroki's battle live, but he couldn't bear to see his face without being reminded of the coldness that had lingered there anyway. But Izuku still heard Present Mike's announcements over the TV that had been hooked up in the waiting room meant for the students. Despite not being in the stands as Izuku had originally promised, he still paid attention and silently cheered when Shouto Todoroki was named the winner. It was only when the door opened and the next competitor came into the room that Izuku took his leave. Izuku still didn't know how to get back to the announcer's booth. He was still lost within UA's stadium, but he didn't particularly mind. It left him a lot of time to think as he wandered the maze of annoyingly familiar corridors. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he allowed his thoughts to run rampant around his mind. Before he knew it, he was sitting in the corner of the room as Yamada and Aizawa did their jobs. The sounds of students fighting echoed around him, but he was hardly paying attention. The look of distress that Todoroki had worn was still engraved in his mind. Even though it seemed like things were going to get better, that they were going to talk it out, Izuku was still nervous. Although he had had friendships before his death, none of them lasted very long. In this world, useless things were abandoned, forgotten. Izuku had walked down this path countless times before, and he knew exactly where it would end. Eventually, everyone left. He was a worthless Deku after all. He wished he could believe that Todoroki would be different. He wished and hoped and prayed that maybe they could work this out, but Izuku knew the cruel reality. Todoroki had asked him to never lie again, but Izuku couldn't do that. If he stopped lying, if he laid the truth bare in front of his friend, everything he had worked so hard to build would come crumbling down. Todoroki could never find out that Izuku Midoriya was dead. That Deku, his friend, was a ghost. Although it pained him, Izuku would try his best to fix the broken trust between them, but he couldn't let Todoroki find out the truth about him. The thing was, he was a terrible liar, and he could only slip up so many times before Todoroki found everything out on his own. So Izuku would try to talk it out, try to regain the trust he had lost. But if his best wasn't good enough, he'd let go. If his presence proved to be a hindrance to Todoroki's future, he'd gladly distance himself from the boy. Izuku had already lived his life, but his friend still had decades ahead of him. Izuku couldn't allow himself to be the reason why Todoroki was always looking back. He had to continue forward, even if that meant Izuku would be alone again. Because Izuku Midoriya wasn't going anywhere. He wanted, desperately, to be selfish, to hold on to Todoroki, to continue to be his friend. He wanted to sit by the lake and tell stories and laugh until he couldn't remember the punchline. He wanted to get closer and learn more about Todoroki. He still wanted to be Todoroki's friend. But Izuku wasn't a selfish person. Not when he had spent his entire life trying to make others happy. If everything came tumbling down and Todoroki decided that he no longer wanted to be Izuku's friend, Izuku would disappear from his life without complaint. For now, however, Izuku still had hope that they could work things out. That didn't mean that he wasn't prepared for the worst-case scenario, though. Problem child, Aizawa sighed, sitting down before him. Izuku hadn't even noticed that the man had moved until he spoke. Izuku's eyes fluttered up to meet the pro-heroes, who just seemed exhausted, more so than usual. You've been hiding in this corner ever since you came back. Something must have happened during your little adventure. So spill. The corners of Izuku's lips pinched into a tight smile. Many things happened during my little adventure, he chirped, squeezing his knees tighter together. I got lost. I almost had a run-in with Kakin. And I had a conversation with Todoroki. Shouto, not Endeavor, I never did manage to find that man. He's a slippery one, I tell ya. Aizawa cocked an eyebrow. An unamused expression painted across his newly scarred face. Midoriya, I made a friend. That friend doesn't know I'm dead. They found out I was lying about something. And they told me to never lie again. I obviously can't tell them I'm actually dead, so I'm scared they won't want to be my friend anymore, Izuku spat out, the words spilling from his lips faster than his brain could keep up. He knew that Aizawa wouldn't judge him, that the man would try his best to help him through his problems. It was just the sort of hero Aizawa was, but Izuku had never had many reliable adults in his life. You know, Izuku added after a breath, usual ghost stuff. The pro-hero blinked, his dark eyes thoughtful. Do you understand the risks and consequences of continuing this relationship with this friend of yours?" he asked, his voice quiet and serious. Izuku's gaze fell to the floor, his eyes burning. "I know that it's not going to have a nice ending. I know that if he learns that I'm not who he thinks I am, it's going to hurt him." There was a beat of silence. "Do you still want to be his friend?" Izuku nodded. Aizawa let out a tired breath before patting the boy's head. A lot of people were doing that recently. Did he really look so sad that he needed someone to comfort him? If you understand and you still want to be his friend, then all you have to do is talk to him. It's as simple as that, he stated, ruffling Izuku's hair. Is it really that easy? Izuku asked, his hands curling into fists across his shins. What if he hates me afterward? If he doesn't even allow you to explain yourself, to try and fix things, he wasn't a true friend. Izuku's throat tightened, but his body released whatever tension it was holding onto. Izuku wasn't stupid enough to not see the value and truth behind Aizawa's words. Honestly, if things had been different, he might have believed every word the pro-hero uttered. The thing was, there was a lot wrong with him, too much to possibly fix. People weren't always patient, and he couldn't expect them to wait around forever while he tried to mold himself to fit their ideals. He couldn't afford to be picky when he chose his friends. He would take whatever the world threw at him. Izuku just didn't want to be alone again. Shoto shouldn't have been surprised to see Deku waiting in the preparation room before his final match. But in all truth, he was. He wasn't expecting to open the door and see the green-haired boy sitting on the table, his back to Shoto. His aloof, viridian gaze was glued to the television across the room, and Shoto wondered if the boy even noticed his presence. Even when the door clicked shut quietly behind him, Deku didn't move an inch from his spot, and his expression remained the same. Shoto distantly recalled the blatant horror and recognition that had frozen across the boy's face the last time he'd seen him. It broke his heart a little to see that expression on Deku, especially knowing that it was all his fault. It hurt even worse when those emotions were shoved beneath a blanket of nonchalance as he felt Deku slowly pulling away. Shoto distinctly remembered when Deku's eyes drifted away from his voice and words growing colder and more formal as the rift between them expanded. It had never been Shoto's intention to hurt Deku. He would never wish to see his friend in pain, but at the time, he had been angry. Angry because Deku had lied to him, even if it was a trivial matter. Angry because he had just had a one-sided conversation with Endeavor. Guilt had consumed him immediately, which was the main reason why he promised to speak to Deku later. He wanted to apologize, to talk things out like normal people. Shoto just hadn't been expecting to see his friend so soon. Duh, you're fighting Katsuki next, right? Deku interrupted, as though he hadn't already known the answer to that question. Deku and Bakugo have a history together. Shoto realized this, and he could only guess that it wasn't a pretty one judging by how Deku, kind, gentle Deku, had pushed him to get away from Bakugo. There was fear then, too, but of a different sort. The kind he showed then was desperate, miserable, as though seeing Bakugo's face made Deku terribly sad. No matter how many times the boy stated that he wasn't scared of the explosion quirk user, Shoto didn't quite believe him. Yes, he replied, shortly. Deku hummed softly to himself, seeming to contemplate something Shoto couldn't see or understand. All of his attacks begin with a right hook. You could probably only use that against him once or twice. Katsuki is smart. He knows when he has to change up tactics. He doesn't like being predictable, but he always has been, the boy stated, a quiet nostalgic feeling trickling into his voice. Why are you telling me this? Shoto murmured, his eyes narrowing, but still, Deku didn't turn to face him. His gaze remained stubbornly on the screen. He couldn't help but feel that Deku was purposely avoiding Shoto's eyes, but the reason remained unclear. Perhaps he had cut the boy a bit too deeply back then. Deku scratched at the scar marring his cheek before speaking. Katsuki isn't going to hold back against you. He's going to throw everything he has in his arsenal to beat you. I am well aware of that. I don't want him to hold back either. Shoto wished he could have seen Deku's expression then. Maybe then he could have seen the strained smile stretched across the boy's lips. It's going to be a tough battle. He hates losing. Shoto crossed his arms over his chest. I can handle Bakugo's tantrums. You've only used your fire quirk once during the entirety of the sports festival, Deku suddenly stated, his voice uncharacteristically monotonous. Though I can only assume it was accidental. You really despise the idea of using your fire, huh, Todoroki? Shoto blinked in surprise, any words that had formed on his tongue dying before they reached his lips. Something in his chest tightened as he stared at the back of the boy's head. You know exactly why I don't want to use his power, D. I know why you hate him. I know the things he did, what he forced you to do. Yet, I still don't fully understand why you would deny half of yourself. It's not that simple. Deku cocked his head, his curls falling towards one side. If you're only using half of your power, isn't that just, quite literally actually, half-assing it? Doing something like that doesn't help anyone, especially not yourself, he breathed, his voice light as though he was reading from sort of script he had formulated in his mind. which, knowing Deku, may have been entirely true. Winning against Katsuki will be difficult unless you give it your all, just like he will. Shoto shook his head, even though he knew that Deku couldn't see the action. I don't want to use my father's power to win this battle or any battle whatsoever. I want to prove to him that I am perfectly capable, even without his fire. Deku was deathly silent for a handful of heartbeats. Why would it be Endeavor's power? Deku wondered aloud. His words were no softer than a whisper, but they still made Shoto's heart freeze in his chest. Doesn't it belong to you? It's your power, isn't it, Todoroki? A pang shattered through Shoto's body as his eyes widened. Finally, Deku turned over his shoulder to steal a glance at the boy standing by the doorway. A neutral expression blanketed his expression, but Shoto could see signs of determination and stubbornness residing in his gaze. The smallest of smiles tilted his lips upward, but it was real. It was genuine, even if it lacked its usual brightness. I know that you might still be angry at me for lying, but right now, I'm telling you the truth. I have full confidence that you can beat Katsuki, and you can do it using your power, he stated as if it was a natural truth that everyone already knew. After your match is over, I'll tell you the truth, I promise. I promise. Shoto could only nod, still taken aback by Deku's encouraging words. He believed him, believed every single word Deku said. Shoto would hold him to that promise. A lot of things didn't scare Izuku anymore. After all, what did he have to be afraid of now? He was dead. Nothing could hurt him. No matter what happened, he'd always recover, as ironic as it might have sounded. There was a time when he was terrified of pain. He always believed that it was a strange fear for someone who was quirkless to have, but no matter how many times he was hurt, he was still scared. All of the dark, sickly-looking bruises that mottled his skin, his legs, his wrists, his cheeks, they horrified him. All the cuts and scrapes he received, either unintentionally or intentionally, set above a wave of dread curdling in his stomach that he never knew how to get rid of. He'd often count the blemishes caused by others, sometimes himself, and wonder what was wrong with him. Kaken was the worst. Hearing the crackling of the nitroglycerin as the small sparks popped from the boy's hands was almost worse than the actual explosion. Feeling the bubbling heat rise as Kaken's hand came closer to his body left him a stuttering, trembling mess. The explosions burned his skin, and the punches and kicks would form disgusting purple bruises along his skin in places no one but him would ever see. But it was the laughter and harsh words that hurt him the most. That sort of pain, the one that cut deeper than any knife, burned more than any explosion, was the kind he feared. While physical pain still terrified him, those wounds would eventually heal, and there were times when those injuries came from helping others, that he'd never regret them. But words bore no wounds. There was no clear fix. One couldn't just slap a bandage on it and it'd be magically all better. Words were cruel. Injuries caused by words forced Izuku to look inward, to sink to a place where he never liked going, to investigate the damage. But it was easier to clean a scraped knee than to convince himself that Kaken's words were meaningless and held no weight. Izuku had always hated confrontation. But now, there was nothing to be afraid of. He couldn't feel pain. The anticipation didn't scare him because the end result would be nothing. No matter how many times Kaken threw his explosions at him now, Izuku would never be able to even feel their heat. Emotional pain was a little different, but it could be shoved down and hidden away for good measure. Izuku was becoming frighteningly talented at it. Izuku wasn't afraid of pain anymore. At least, that's what he convinced himself. It wasn't until he saw Aizawa's grim expression and felt his heart drop into his stomach that he realized that he was still scared. He was still that terrified little boy that hid in the bathroom to clean his own wounds because he didn't want his mom to see. He was still that boy that flinched at every loud noise, fearing that it was Kaken coming to hurt him again. He was still that pathetic child that locked his door on nights when his mother was working so his father wouldn't come in his room. Nothing changed. Izuku stilled in the hallway, just another turn away from the announcer's booth. Aizawa had apparently just been searching for him. For whatever reason, Izuku wasn't sure he wanted to know. Aizawa's dark eyes were gentle, but the harsh glower on his lips told a different story. Izuku had seen that look 100 times on teachers' faces. It usually meant that something terrible had happened, but they weren't sure whether they should comfort him or be straightforward. He clasped his hands behind his back so Aizawa wouldn't see the blood if he lost control of his emotion. He felt the sudden urge to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but something in the pro-hero's gaze rooted him to the floor. Is something wrong, Aizawa? Izuku asked, meekly, his voice pathetically weak even to his own ears. I need you to come with me. There was a quiet urgency hiding behind Aizawa's usual mask of indifference. It set Izuku's nerve endings on fire. He wanted to run, to hide. He wanted to leave before Aizawa told him the bad news. He didn't want to hear it. He wanted to remain right where he was. He wanted to keep being Todoroki's friend. He wanted to play with Aizawa's cats. He wanted to stay. He didn't want to change anything. Midoriya. Izuku shook his head, his eyes falling to the floor. He knew he was acting like a spoiled child, but he didn't care. You're going to tell me something bad, he whispered. his hands clenching into fists behind his back. "You're going to tell me something bad, and I won't be able to unhear it, and it's going to hurt. I don't want to know, just don't tell me." Aizawa didn't say a word for a long while, but Izuku didn't mind. As long as he didn't say whatever was making him look so serious, so pained, it didn't matter. Izuku was all right with remaining oblivious. If it had to do with his father or the League of Villains, it wasn't a big deal. If it had to do with the fall of a hero, Izuku didn't care. If something had happened to his mother or his friends, he didn't want to know. "I just received a call from the police stating that a group..." "Aizawa, please." He seemed to contemplate the boy's plea, if only for a moment, but he continued on anyway. "That a group of villains vandalized your grave and your body is currently missing." Izuku froze. The tension receded from his body, his hands falling uselessly at his sides. He didn't look up at Aizawa, but his words played on an endless loop in his head. What?" He choked out, his throat threatening to close shut. "The police and a few pro-heroes have been trying to hunt down the culprits, but so far, there haven't been any leads." The urge to run was replaced with laughter bubbling in his throat. He wanted to roll on the floor until his laughter strangled him. He recalled the day of his funeral. He had thought about grave robbers looting his coffin, but it was more of a joke than anything. He was never serious. After all, what would anyone want with the corpse of a deceased, quirkless, 15-year-old boy? Especially one as plain and boring as Izuku Midoriya. It was beyond Izuku's comprehension. When Aizawa shuffled his feet, a nervous habit that Izuku hadn't seen until now. "Midoriya, whatever you're thinking, I can't anything about it, Aizawa, you know that. I can't commit vigilantism because I'm a ghost. And I'm quirkless, so just answer the question." The hero seemed to hesitate, if only for a moment. The harshness of his mouth eased into a soft frown, and Izuku knew that he had chosen the comforting route. He was probably well aware that if Izuku lost control of his emotions in a place where a few people could possibly see him, he'd start a panic. Approximately 2 hours ago, he acquiesced. A passerby saw that the grave was dug up and called it in. Forensics just arrived at the scene 15 minutes ago. Izuku supposed that this would have been the moment where he screamed and broke down in a fit of fiery rage. But that had never been his thing. The boy was never one to get angry, even if he had a pretty good idea of who the culprit was. Maybe he was submissive. But even during the times when others would have yelled heartless insults, Izuku only remained quiet and continued smiling. He wouldn't get angry. Wrathful thinking would never get him far in life. He wasn't angry now. He certainly wasn't happy, but he was calm. Even though he knew, objectively, that this was a huge loss, that an entire piece of who he used to be was literally missing, he didn't feel an ounce of despair. Izuku didn't feel much of anything about the subject. He had long since come to terms with the fact that the body that used to be in the ground was Izuku Midoriya. The ghost he was now was only a fraction of that boy. Izuku wasn't entirely whole, which meant that he could never fully be Izuku Midoriya again. "I know that you wanted to stay and have fun at the sports festival, but I wanted to tell you before you found out on your own," the underground hero stated, softly, as if he didn't want Izuku to freak out in the middle of the hallway. "The police don't have any idea why villains took your body." Izuku nodded, finally looking up to meet Aizawa's eyes, which were still gentle despite the childishness he displayed earlier. The boy offered a weak smile. "It's all right," he said, shoving his hands into the pockets of his shorts. "This might sound a little strange, but that body doesn't mean much to me anymore. I don't feel any attachment to it. I mean, now, it's just a pile of decomposing flesh and bone. I don't feel particularly sad that someone took it, nor am I angry that they vandalized my grave either." Aizawa's eyes were doubtful, but he didn't say another word about it. "I'm sorry, Midoriya," he uttered, but Izuku could tell that he really meant it. Izuku grinned, the memory of the promise he made to Todoroki swirling around his head. He had promised that he would tell him the truth, or at least as much of the truth as he was able to, after his battle. Izuku didn't want to be a liar. He didn't want to break a promise. He didn't want to be a bad person. But what if? What if his mom was there? What if she was at his gravesite right now? What if he could see her again after all these months? And even if she wasn't, the police would eventually call her up for questioning. They could lead him straight to her. Izuku could finally see her again. But was it worth the cost of breaking a promise? Especially when Todoroki was already hurt because Izuku had lied. "I've been called out to help hunt down the villains responsible," Aizawa stated, noticing his silence. "Do you want to go?" Izuku could hear the explosions that rang out from the area, the boisterous cheering of the crowd. Shoto and Kaken had already begun their battle, and he was missing it because of his indecisiveness. He didn't want to be a terrible friend, but he didn't want to let go of the chance to be reunited with his mother again. He didn't want to be a liar, but he missed her so much. "Go on ahead without me," Izuku muttered, gazing down at his shoes in defeat. "I'll catch up after this match." "All right," Aizawa murmured just as softly, brushing past the boy towards the exit. The man paused next to Izuku, his hand rising to ruffle his green curls for the second time that day before continuing on as though nothing happened. Izuku nodded to himself before rushing out to the announcer's booth, watching the battle between his newest friend and his oldest. He had promised to cheer Todoroki on, and Izuku would still tell him the truth, just not immediately after. A promise was still a promise. Izuku wasn't sure what he was expecting to see once he arrived at his gravesite, but it was rather underwhelming if he was being honest. A handful of unfamiliar faces of policemen and forensic specialists were wandering about as they attempted to gather as much evidence as they were able to, though, judging by some frustrated expressions, there wasn't much to go on. Most of the people crowded around a gray stone that had shattered into pieces and a large pile of unearthed dirt. His coffin, rested just beside the burial site, where only 9 months ago, Izuku had watched as it was lowered into the ground, his body with it. The casket was wide open now, revealing a small indent in the fabric that lined the inside where his body should have resided. Izuku was secretly glad that his body wasn't there. He didn't want to see what it had become after 9 months. A little ways away, Izuku noticed Aizawa speaking to a cop wearing a white button-up shirt and a tan fedora, but their words were hushed. Izuku could only see the cop's expression, and it possessed a grimness that perfectly fit the situation at hand. Izuku looked away, stalking towards his grave with the motivation of someone who knew it was too late to turn back but was still tempted to. His footsteps were hesitant, slow, but eventually he was inevitably standing just over the gaping hole in the ground. There was only dirt and maybe a few stray chunks of his gravestone that had fallen inside when it was destroyed within the hole. His casket was to his left, being examined by a few forensic scientists to see if the culprits had left any trace of themselves behind. His gravestone was in 1,000 pieces, some of the stone scorched black with what seemed like soot. His name was no longer legible, not with so many pieces smashed to dust. The flowers that had been left there were little more than colorful specks of dust littering the ground. He remembered thinking that, eventually, his grave would blend in with the rest around it, that the grass would grow over the fresh dirt, and his shiny, new grave marker would dull and fade with time and weather, that the flowers that rested in front of his etched name would wither and be replaced with fresh ones, that eventually, those flowers would stop coming, and the grass would grow untamed and wild. He remembered thinking that it would eventually become neglected as the years passed, as Kaken slowly forgot about him and his mother became too old to take care of it, that he would become just another stone in a whole forest of the dead. He knew this from the very beginning, and he had come to terms with it. But this, he never once believed that the traces of his existence would vanish one by one. He never thought that it would be his father's doing either. Though there was no definitive evidence, some things simply clicked in Izuku's mind. His father's recent appearance, the slaughter of those few quirkless kids, the scorch marks staining the stone, the relation to Izuku Midoriya, it all made sense. For the police, it might take a while to connect all the dots, but it didn't matter. Soon enough, they'd find out that Hisashi Midoriya was the one responsible, and they'd know that he was planning something wicked. And if it was Hisashi Midoriya who committed this crime, and if the recent rumors were to be believed, the League of Villains was somehow involved. Izuku used to be well known for his optimism, at seeing the bright side of things, but right now, he didn't think there was any hope that could be salvaged from this situation. The first time that Shouta had seen Enko Midoriya was in a graveyard, several months after her son's death. He had scarcely heard Izuku talk about the woman, perhaps only once or twice in the whole time he's known the boy, so he wasn't sure what image he had painted of her in his mind. He had assumed that she'd be like Izuku, same bright green eyes and warm grin on her lips. She was most likely a kind, loving woman who cared about her son more than anyone else on the planet. In all truth, Shouta didn't know what Enko Midoriya would be like at all. If she managed to raise someone like Izuku all on her own, then she must have been a wonderful woman, Shouta had no doubt. The thought to ask Izuku about her was immediately out of the question. For starters, there was no way to discreetly ask the ghost when the place was swarming with police officers and the forensic unit. Not only that, but Shouta didn't want to upset the boy any more than he already was. Despite how Midoriya had claimed that he wasn't overly heartbroken by this event, there was not a bone in Shouta's body that believed him, no matter how convincing of a liar Midoriya was. And the boy was a damn good one. The haunted expression he wore as he stood over his empty grave was proof enough. Shouta had been half tempted to go over to comfort him, but there was never an opportunity to do so. It was during that moment that Enko Midoriya decided to arrive. Frantic emerald eyes, red with fear, rivers of tears streaming down plump cheeks, lips twisted into a horrified grimace. That was the first time Shouta laid his tired eyes on Izuku Midoriya's mother. She had been a mess of tears and panicked breaths as she laid her brokenly familiar eyes on the destruction that had been her son's resting place. There was no fury, no vengeful wrath, just a pure, gut-wrenching desperation and misery that only a mother could possess when faced with her child's cruel fate. "What happened?" Enko cried, What happened to my baby? Shouta felt something in his chest clench as she screamed, his heart aching at the raw pain in her voice. No matter how many times he dealt with these situations as an underground hero, this time was different in a way Shouta could barely express. He hadn't actually met Izuku Midoriya until after his death. He didn't have to suffer through his passing, didn't have to see his family and friends crumble to pieces after his loss. Unlike the woman before him, Shouta never had to grow accustomed to Izuku's absence, because in his eyes, the boy never really left. He was still around, still smiling and laughing and so very much alive. There were times when Shouta even forgot that Izuku Midoriya wasn't supposed to be there. Times when he forgot that Izuku Midoriya was dead. But Enko, she wasn't as blessed as Shouta was. She couldn't see him, couldn't speak with him, couldn't hear him ramble for hours about heroes anymore. To her, her son was irreversibly gone. And there was no force or quirk in this world or the next that could bring him back again. To her, Izuku had been dead for these last few months. The guilt that flooded Shouta's body surprised him. The underground hero spared a look in Izuku's direction as Detective Tsukachi rushed in to stop Enko from getting any closer. Whether it was to save her from the mental image it would carve or prevent her from accidentally messing with the crime scene, Shouta wasn't sure. Izuku's shoulders were slouched, his body seemingly wanting to crumple in on itself as he stood by his empty casket. His eyes were a sickly, exhausted hue, and the smile that he had been missing for a while was still nowhere to be found. Almost absent-mindedly, his nails scratched at the scars littering the too pale skin of his forearms. Perhaps if he had been alive, if his skin had still been as soft and thin as it was before his death, he might have drawn blood, but he didn't. Slowly, as if drawing out the inevitable, Izuku made his way towards his mother, his lips smoothing into the ghost of a smile naturally. The tiredness seemed to be erased from his features, slipping from his expression as easily as water through the cracks of his fingers. His hands fell away from his arms, clasping them behind his back as he approached the distraught woman. It worried Shouta how simple it was for Izuku to bury his panic, to put on a grin and pretend everything was all right. He couldn't help but wonder if it was an old habit or if something else was going on. "Mom," the boy chastised, gently, as though she was embarrassing him, but he didn't mind as much as he let on. "Really, there's no need to cry. Everything's going to be okay." Shouta was sure that if Enko could hear him, could interact with her son, those words would have comforted her. They were filled with so much love and care that the pro-hero could hardly believe that they came from a ghost. But alas, Enko was blind to Izuku's existence. She didn't know that he was right there, just feet away from her. His mother continued to sob and demand answers from the detective. Shouta could see a familiar, determined light burning in her eyes, but it was for an entirely different reason than from when he saw it in Izuku's. Detective Tsukachi tried his best to calm her down. But Enko Midoriya was a force to be reckoned with. Izuku's hands hovered just mere centimeters from his mother's shoulders. He seemed to be muttering more comforting whispers, but they yielded the same effectiveness as the previous ones. Shouta could see the desperation growing in the boy's eyes as he bustled around Enko as though he was trying to catch her attention. Shouta wasn't stupid enough to believe that Izuku didn't know that no matter how loudly he screamed, how much he begged and cried, Enko would never see him standing beside her. "Where's my son?" There was only silence then. No one dared to answer her. The boy's lips contorted in a broken grimace, his hands retreating away from his mother slowly like every movement pained him. Everything seemed to crumple in the boy's expression. His award-winning grin, his carefully bright eyes, the joy masking whatever was beneath. It all slipped away as Detective Tsukachi ushered Enko away to some other policeman. Izuku remained horribly still, his gaze still locked on his mother. Shouta hadn't realized that the boy wasn't breathing until that moment. His chest was unnaturally still. No breath, no heartbeat, nothing. It wasn't until then that it finally, permanently, hit Shouta that Izuku Midoriya was dead. When Izuku stood frozen amongst the raw life surrounding him, it became abundantly clear to Shouta that Izuku wasn't like them. His time had ceased, his heart and life along with it. He may have been one of the liveliest people the underground hero had ever met, but it was only his personality. No matter how brightly he shined, it wouldn't bring him back to life. He was a ghost standing with the living. The only one who could see him here was Shouta. Perhaps that's what the true meaning of disappearing was. Being completely surrounded by others, but still being unable to communicate with them, to tell them that I am still here. Maybe it was watching the world continue on while you remained hopelessly rooted in the same place. That realization hit Shouta much harder than he thought it would. Shouta searched the entire arena twice and then another time in case he had somehow missed a room or closet somewhere the second time around. There was no sign of Deku anywhere. It was like the boy simply vanished from the planet, or maybe more accurately, the vicinity. It was either that or Bakugo's blasts had knocked him a little too hard on the head and he was blind to the green-haired boy's presence. Shouta knew the second option was just foolish optimism. Where he got that, he would never know or admit. If Shouta hadn't known what sort of person Deku was, he would have believed that he had been duped, that Deku had lied to him once again. He would have believed that his friend had abandoned him, leaving him to the wolves to be devoured without a word, without any answers. He would have believed that Deku had left silently, never to be seen again. But Shadow knew that Deku was kinder than that. The boy would never just abandon him without saying anything. He would probably apologize 1,001 times before even taking a step, no matter how much Deku hated someone. Not that Shadow thought Deku hated him, he would never leave them hanging, not without explaining himself first. Besides, Deku promised him, and he wasn't lying then. Yet, no matter how many times Shadow tried to convince himself that something must have happened, that he knew what sort of person Deku was, there was a persistent voice buzzing in the back of his mind. A voice that whispered he didn't know Deku nearly as well as he thought he did. Shadow shook off the thought before it could fester, looking around the clearly empty hallway once more. After his final battle against Bakugo, chaos ensued. He had managed to use his fire. Though his blood had boiled and his stomach had twisted into knots every moment the flames coated his skin, against the explosive boy, Deku's words had encouraged him, had broken him free from the chains he had wrapped around himself, and he had won. He beat Bakugo, but only just barely. If Deku hadn't informed him of Bakugo's weakness, he might not have won at all. But despite it all, Shadow had pushed Bakugo out of bounds. It was standing upon the pedestal that Shadow realized that something terrible must have happened. It was announced that both Iida and Bakugo were called away due to personal or family reasons, and they could not accept the medals. So second and third place was given to the runner-ups. Shadow's footsteps suddenly stalled. If Bakugo had been called away for personal reasons, and considering his connection with Deku, did his disappearance have something to do with why Bakugo had to leave? Was Deku somehow involved in the matter as well? It was certainly possible, but what could have happened? Hey, little listener, a familiar, uncomfortably loud voice boomed from behind him. Shadow involuntarily flinched at the sudden noise. He turned around, seeing his teacher, Present Mike, strolling towards him with a permanent, small smile on his lips. Is there something you're looking for? Shadow silently debated whether or not he should ask for his teacher's help. Present Mike was certainly a people person, but he wasn't so sure about how helpful the hero could actually be. It wasn't as if the man could possibly remember every single face he's seen, if he's even seen Deku at all. But it couldn't hurt to ask, right? I'm looking for a friend of mine. Present Mike cocked his head, his strange green eyes flashing behind his yellow-tinted glasses. Is it one of your classmates? If so, they've probably already headed back to the campus, or maybe even home, he said, tapping his finger to his chin in thought. Shadow shook his head. He doesn't go to school at UA, he explained, turning to fully face his teacher. I wanted to talk to him after the sports festival, but I haven't been able to find him. The pro hero nodded. Well, the place is clearing out, so maybe you'll find him eventually, he hummed, his lips pinching slightly at the corners. What does he look like? Maybe I can point him in your direction if I see him. He's a little shorter than me, green hair and eyes, freckles, usually wears red shoes and strange t-shirts, and he is a hero fanatic. Present Mike's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Not enough to be too suspicious, but enough to be noticeable to Shadow. It was a familiar look that Shadow had grown accustomed to over the years. For some reason, Present Mike seemed to be analyzing him, for weaknesses or perhaps something, maybe a lie of some sort. Shadow didn't know. It wasn't long until the grin slipped from Present Mike's face, revealing an unreadable emotion beneath it. You're talking about Aizawa's little ghost boy, aren't you? The man murmured, more of a statement rather than a question. His eyes darkened as he gazed down at Shadow, and for a moment, the boy wondered if it was a mistake to ask for his help. But what was more surprising than the expression his teacher wore was the spark of recognition in his voice. Ghost boy. Present Mike's brow furrowed before he pointed to his cheek. Does he happen to have a scar on his face? He inquired hesitantly. And when Shadow nodded, his expression morphed into something calmer, smoother. I've met the little listener a couple of times. Real smart kid. Almost scarily so, but he's a bit on the troublemaker side. He basically haunts Aizawa now. Shadow's eyes widened, his fingers curling slowly into fists. Deku knows Aizawa as well. Present Mike waited a beat too long to answer. You could say that he's like Aizawa's ward. Aizawa watches over him, but the little listener pretty much does whatever he wants, he stated, scratching his chin as he let out a tired sigh. There was a rare exhaustion dimming the usual glee in his teacher's eyes, one that Shadow had never seen before in Present Mike. Anyway, you said you were looking for him? Shadow nodded once more, an icy nervousness clawing its way up from his stomach as the exhaustion grew in Mike's eyes. Have you seen him around? The boy asked, but he felt like he already knew the answer. In all the months that Shadow had known his English teacher, never once had he appeared this serious. He could feel the shift, the darkening of the atmosphere between them. Thousands of warning signs blared in his mind, even more so when Present Mike crossed his arms over his chest, his voice taking on a sharp edge. Your friend left shortly after you won your last match. There was some sort of emergency he needed to attend to, but he stayed long enough to watch you fight. Shadow's jaw tensed. Do you know if he's alright? What happened? Present Mike shrugged, stiffly. Aizawa is with him, so I think he'll be fine. As for what happened, his voice trailed off, his lips pursing tightly together. I don't have any idea. All I know is that Eraserhead was called out and he took his little ghost ward with him. Silence followed, but Shadow was more concerned about the disappearance of Deku. If it was an urgent matter that came up unexpectedly, then Shadow would have understood completely. He would have waited patiently until Deku was ready to tell him everything, even if it wasn't immediately after the sports festival like he originally promised. He didn't mind that his friend had vanished out of thin air because Shadow knew that he always returned eventually. What worried him this time around was the fact that Eraserhead, an underground hero, was deployed at the same time that both Deku and Bakugo were called away for emergencies. It was concerning, not because they disappeared together, but because Shadow knew nothing about what was happening. It could have been something like the death of a family member, or perhaps even an accident involving someone they knew. The fact was that Shadow knew absolutely nothing. Deku could have been sitting in a hospital room, watching someone he cared about withering away, or he could have been waiting in a police station for one reason or another. Nothing was for certain. Shadow was in the dark, and the dark was the one place he didn't want to be when it came to Deku's well-being. Thank you, Shadow breathed, his eyes drifting to the floor as he prepared to turn away. I'll just talk to him the next time I see him. Todoroki. Shadow froze, glancing at his teacher from the corner of his eye. If I were you, I wouldn't get too attached to him. You never know when he might disappear for good. For good, Deku gone forever. Shadow could only nod and walk away before he could spit venomous words at his teacher with good intention. It wasn't possible, not in 1,000 years. Besides, it was already far too late for that. As much as Shadow hated to admit it, he was already attached to Deku. He was his first friend, the first person he confided in about his life. Deku had been there for him like a safe haven to escape the pain he was forced to endure at home. His was a comforting presence that always seemed to make Shadow's demons vanish from his mind. But most importantly, Shadow didn't want to let go of his friend, not when they had just fought. Shadow would be stubborn on this matter, and in the end, if Deku did disappear, Shadow would find him. He always did. Izuku couldn't sleep. A few days after his death, he had curled up on his perfectly made bed in a protective ball and closed his eyes. He had tried to immerse himself in dreams of heroes and villains, but they refused to lull him into a comforting slumber. No matter how long he waited in the darkness behind his eyelids, he couldn't sleep. He had waited there the entire night, trapping himself in the shadows out of desperation for normalcy. He had only tried once, however. The darkness had reminded him of the wailing and crying and pain he had to endure in the very beginning. He was too scared to try again. However, that didn't stop the daydreams that flooded through his mind like thick, murky water. They clouded his sense of time, dulled his awareness. Early on, he had learned to snap himself out of these little visions because if he didn't, entire days would go by, and he wouldn't notice. They would escape from his fragile fingers, and Izuku would never get them back again. He couldn't pick up the time he had let go of. That wasn't how it worked. Once something was lost, Izuku would never get it back again. But those daydreams were how he was getting through his days now. For the last few days, Izuku had been alone and trapped inside his old apartment. Aizawa was either patrolling or teaching at UA, or hunting down the villains responsible for destroying his grave. The underground hero was constantly busy with work, and the times when Izuku saw him at home, he looked more tired than the dead. The dark bags beneath his eyes had grown deeper, more bruised, and he always almost immediately went to bed. Even if it was lonely without being able to talk to Aizawa, Izuku didn't want to bother him. The man was already working hard enough. He shouldn't have to deal with Izuku's problems as well. Since the sports festival, Izuku hadn't gone to see Todoroki at the lakeside where they usually met. He hadn't spoken to him at all despite the promise that was burning in the back of his mind the entire time. Izuku knew that, eventually, he'd have to give in and brave up. He couldn't keep avoiding this conflict forever. If he wanted to keep Todoroki as a friend, he'd have to go see him soon and stop procrastinating. He just had yet to work up the courage to do so. And it was almost impossible to find Nana unless he went to UA, or hunted down All Might. Yet, if Izuku did that, that meant he'd have to search all through UA, and he could possibly run into Todoroki. Not to mention that Aizawa would probably get annoyed that Izuku was roaming the halls of his workplace. He didn't want to disturb Aizawa any more than he probably was, so there was no one else that Izuku could talk to. Sure, Yamada could see him, but he had a feeling the pro hero didn't particularly enjoy his company. Not that Izuku could be upset. He wouldn't want to hang around with the ghost of a teenage boy either. Izuku hadn't left the house at all since he saw his mother in the cemetery, though no one would notice anyway. There were only a handful of people who could see him. No one would care if he isolated himself for a while, and the people that might have were too busy or not around to pay him much attention. So Izuku daydreamed in the living room, letting flashing images of hazy memories and old dreams consume his thoughts for hours on end. Some days were calm, gentle even, Those were the times when his mind was filled with cheerful moments and he wasn't afraid. The peaceful memories of eating katsudon with his mother filled his empty chest with a buzzing warmth. All the times he played heroes and villains with Kaken when they were younger and too naive to the world to know anything. Those memories circulated in his mind on a constant loop for days on end, and he allowed them to. But there were days, or perhaps just hours or minutes or seconds, when his thoughts became twisted and hideous as if dipped in slick, black oil. Darkness seeped into the warmth, and suddenly, there was nothing but a familiar, cold emptiness echoing within him. His hazy memories sharpened when he was reminded of the bad days. The throbbing pain exploding through his body, the tears he choked down, the heart-squeezing fear that clenched around his throat in a vice grip. Those moments cut him deep, leaving trails of sickening scarlet blood bubbling along his skin. When his daydreams turned into nightmares, it was a gradual process, one he couldn't escape from. It was achingly slow, and each time he knew that he was slipping beneath the murky water's surface. He didn't cry out for help though. That was never an option. He would always choke it down, bury the dark panic deep beneath layers of fragile joy and blinding smiles. There was no one around who could save him. Izuku didn't think someone like him deserved to be saved anyway. If Aizawa suspected anything was wrong with him, he either didn't say anything or blamed it on recent events. Izuku didn't bother telling the underground hero about the thoughts running through his head. It would only make him worry and hinder his work. Aizawa couldn't afford to lose focus now, not while so many people were depending on him. Izuku could suffer in silence. It wasn't any different from his life before he passed away. He was used to dealing with his own problems. It wasn't until one day that Aizawa insisted he come to UA. With him that Izuku wondered if he wasn't being as discreet as he had hoped. The man gave no explanation that morning. Izuku had been sitting on the couch, absent-mindedly petting Miss Fluffernugget when Aizawa had stepped in front of him. It had been one of those bad nights when he couldn't escape the dark thoughts that had taunted him up until the sun had risen the next morning. He hadn't moved from his spot in a few days, and perhaps Aizawa had noticed. He hadn't noticed that Aizawa was in front of him until the man had sat down on the coffee table across from him. But even then, when he was directly across from Izuku, it had still taken him a moment to focus on the man's eternally exhausted eyes. His movements were sluggish like he was drifting through mud. But eventually, Izuku managed to snap himself awake from his daze. "You're coming to school with me today." Izuku had blinked at the serious, almost grim tone Aizawa had used then. He certainly wasn't a jokester, but Izuku had never heard him so somber before. The man left absolutely no room for argument. Not that Izuku could argue against the pro-hero. His mind hadn't been clear enough for that, but that didn't mean he didn't try. "Why?" he had asked, his voice flat and a little harsher than he had intended it to be, but Aizawa didn't seem to care. Aizawa leaned forward a fraction. "There's something I need you to do. If it's to go back to school to learn, I want you to know that I'm still technically a middle schooler and you work at a high school." Aizawa's lips twitched, either in annoyance or amusement. Izuku wasn't sure. "Just come with me. I'll explain more later," he stated, standing up from the coffee table and heading towards the kitchen before Izuku could agree to go or not. Izuku could only watch him go, the protests dying on his lips. Perhaps the man wanted to keep a closer eye on him because of what happened only a few days ago. Or maybe it was because Aizawa suspected something was troubling Izuku. Maybe it was that Aizawa wanted him to feel as though he could do something productive instead of wandering about like some phantom. Whatever the reason, Izuku didn't know if he should be grateful or not. Despite his urge to ignore his request, Izuku still followed Aizawa to school that morning. That's how he ended up waiting in the teacher's lounge for most of the school day. He had hovered around Aizawa's desk while he was away teaching class, occasionally spurring up a conversation with Yamada when no one else was in the room. Those were only short and rare moments though. Yamada was rarely alone. Izuku was almost surprised at how many famous heroes were employed by UA. Of course, he had heard about some of them, and even saw them at the sports festival, but to see them so up close was strange. He was used to watching them from the TV screen or even his computer. He had never thought that someone like him, someone quirkless, would ever be in a room filled with heroes. During break and lunch, he visited with Aizawa, trying to pry the reason the man forced him to come here out of him, but his lips were stubbornly sealed. Apparently, whatever he wanted to say, it couldn't be heard by others. If that was the case, then why did Aizawa drag him to a school? Izuku didn't think he'd ever understand the underground hero. It wasn't until the end of the day that Aizawa was ready to talk. Izuku sat on top of one of the desks in the front of the classroom while Aizawa was leaning against his podium, his arms crossed against his chest. All the students had left the room, leaving just Izuku and Aizawa. He would be lying if he said he wasn't nervous. There was just something in the teacher's gaze that left shivers creeping up Izuku's spine. He never had many good experiences with teachers. Izuku was the first one to break the heavy silence lingering in the room. "Why did you have me spend the entire day here?" Aizawa's glare was aimed at the floor as though he was already hating this conversation. "I need to ask you for a favor," he said, softly. Izuku cocked his head, his eyes narrowing in confusion. The boy leaned forward, interest overshadowing how bewildered he was. A favor, he repeated slowly. What, do you want me to hunt someone for you? Scare a naughty student or an annoying co-worker? See if anyone's talking about you behind your back? Something like that. Aizawa was already shaking his head, strands of raven hair falling in front of his tired face. It's something a little more complicated and serious than that, Midoriya, he said, pushing his stray hair out of the way. It's something only you can do. He seemed to hesitate, to contemplate whether or not he should really be asking Izuku to do this. Something flared in the boy's chest. It might have been determination, maybe something else entirely. A small smile ghosted across his lips. Did you know that my name, Izuku, has 2 different readings? He began, making the man glance up at his sudden question. Deku is the other one if you were wondering. I've literally been called useless for as long as I can remember. It especially became worse after I turned 5 and didn't have a quirk like all my friends. I was just little, useless Deku who couldn't even do the simplest of things right. Midoriya, so if you have a job for me, and it's within my power to do so, I will gladly help you, Aizawa. I may still be useless in some respects, but I will do my best. Aizawa's frown deepened, a strange gleam glimmering in his dark eyes. It wasn't pity or sympathy, but it was something similar. It didn't make Izuku want to rip out his hair piece by piece in frustration, so it wasn't as though he was looking down on the boy. But it was close enough that Izuku wanted to shrink away from the pro hero with 1,000 promises that he was truly okay. During the sports festival, I received a report that Stain had attacked and gravely wounded the pro hero Ingenium. I've heard that he's paralyzed now and isn't able to do hero work anymore, Aizawa explained, his voice growing a little louder with Izuku's reassurance. I trust that you've heard of them. Izuku nodded, his excitement crushed by the heavy news. Stain is a growingly popular vigilante whose ideals are spreading throughout the villain and some civilian community. He is known as the hero killer, and Ingenium is known for his kindness and sense of justice as a pro-hero, Izuku muttered, scratching his chin in thought. The vigilante had appeared on the news more often than not recently. And to be honest, Izuku was almost getting sick of seeing the headlines. Was he one of Stain's targets? That seems a little out of character considering his previous victims. Could it be that Stain's range of targets is growing as his popularity increases? But that doesn't make much sense either. His whole reason for killing heroes is because they are fakes who are blinded by fame and popularity. I doubt he would fall into that same pit. Perhaps he was just incorrect about Ingenium. Or maybe he wanted to prove a point. Midoriya, Ingenium's little brother is one of my students, Aizawa spat, a little harsher than he probably meant to, and Izuku realized that. Deep down, he realized that. This was a sensitive time for him as a teacher. One of his students was probably suffering over his brother's ill fate. And if Izuku remembered correctly, Ingenium was in the same class in high school as Aizawa was. But despite the fact that Izuku knew that, it still stung a little. But it was his fault for being so careless with his words and analysis. He shoved down the small ache forming in his chest. He'd deal with it later like he always did. Tenya Iida, yeah. I saw him fighting at the sports festival. He was powerful and had a strong moral compass, like his brother, Izuku mused, swinging his legs childishly in the air. His gaze had dropped to his blood-red sneakers that somehow had managed to stay with him through it all. Maybe after a few more years of training and experience, he'd make a wonderful hero. Aizawa's head dipped into a small nod. I'm concerned. Izuku leaned back, biting his bottom lip. Ingenium was very lucky to have survived, which meant that Stain was most likely using him to send the heroes a message. From what Izuku had heard from the news, Stain never left his victims alive. And he was, perhaps, one of the most brutal vigilantes this world has seen in a while. It's understandable that Iida would be upset. He could have lost his brother, Izuku murmured, tapping his fingers on the desk. Give him some time to recover mentally, and I'm sure he'll be all right. Normally, I would agree with you, but all of my students are problem children who always do the unexpected, Aizawa sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I'm afraid Iida will do something stupid to get revenge for his brother. Izuku blinked, tilting his head slightly. The thought itself was a strange one. These kids, literal teenagers, were heroes in training. They were growing up surrounded by dozens of role models that would help sculpt them into amazing heroes. They were being taught how to save and protect people from the evil in this world. He didn't want to think that they would give it all up to walk alongside evil for something as simple as petty revenge. But Izuku supposed that grief was a powerful force that could manipulate a child's thoughts easily. All it would take would be a single push and someone would give up everything to obtain a single goal. Even if that meant that they could no longer achieve their other dreams, it didn't matter to them. Revenge was a sickening thing that was more potent than any poison, especially when there was no other outlet for their rage. So what exactly do you want me to do about it? Izuku demanded, his fingers itching to scratch at the scar marring his cheek. A familiar burning sensation prickled across his skin, his scars aching, throbbing. He didn't know why he was getting so agitated over something so trivial, but his confusion didn't stop his hands from twitching anxiously. I want you to follow Iida around for a few days to ensure he isn't planning something dangerous. Nervous laughter bubbled in his throat, but he suppressed it before it could escape his lips. You want me to haunt your student to make sure he doesn't follow Stain's path of vigilantism? Izuku hummed, hopping down from the desk with a silent click of his shoes on the floor. I'm certainly able to do it, but are you sure you want me to? What do you want me to do if it turns out he's actually planning on confronting Stain? I can't exactly stop him. The most I can do is give you a heads up that he is endangering his life, and by then, it might be too late to save him. Aizawa leveled a calculating stare at him, one which Izuku merely returned. I know this is a difficult thing to ask of you, especially after recent events, but you're the only one I can trust with this. Problem child, he said, his voice more gentle than Izuku had ever heard before. And that was saying something considering the numerous times he had heard Aizawa cooing over his cats. Izuku's lips pursed as he finally gave in to his urges and scratched the irritated scar on his face. I'll do it, he stated, firmly. I'll do it, but if push comes to shove, I won't be able to save him from harm. I'm not a hero. A sort of twisted, ironic smile forced its way onto Aizawa's face. Good, because if you were any different, this would be all kinds of illegal. Izuku trudged down the hallway alone, his nails digging into the scarred skin of his arms. Ever since he finished his conversation with Aizawa, his old wounds had been flaring with pain. Something was riling him up, and Izuku hated it. It was almost impossible to focus when every inch of his felt like it was being stabbed with a red-hot fire poker. Sighing heavily, Izuku forced his hands away from his forearms. He had left ahead of Aizawa since he said that he had some papers and assignments he needed to finish grading. Which meant that, once again, Izuku was left alone to wander the hallways of a place he didn't know in search of an exit. Of course, he could easily just phase through the walls and come out the other end. But Izuku was secretly curious about his dream school. Or, at least, what used to be his dream school. He didn't think that people with death certificates could attend such a prestigious place. He wanted to explore the hallways and see what the world was like within these walls, even if it wasn't as a student. Though, he doubted that even if he was still alive, that he would ever be a student here. This place was for heroes in training with a bright, potential-filled future ahead of them. He wouldn't have lasted long anyway. It was a nice dream, though. Izuku chuckled to himself, shaking away the self-deprecating thoughts that threatened to consume him. He had just been freed from the nightmares. Aizawa gave him a mission, a job, a distraction. He couldn't afford to sit around and daydream while Aizawa was relying on him. There was a life, a future in his hands now, and he didn't want to let anyone down again. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let his dark thoughts catch up with him. He couldn't let his daydreams bleed into nightmares again. He had to keep himself busy, distracted. So he continued down the hall, to a destination he couldn't find, to complete a mission he wasn't sure he could accomplish. And he did it alone. Izuku didn't know how it felt to lose someone. Not like how his mother lost him or his father. Not like how Todoroki lost his mother. He had only watched the pain seep into his mother's breaking heart as tears streamed down her face when his father left. He watched her wave him goodbye, saw her expression shatter like glass as her emerald eyes glistened dangerously. He remembered the way her body seemed to curl in on itself like his father's absence had caused her physical pain. He had stood by her side, staring up at her in confusion as she cried because he had been happy. The day his father left, he had been filled to the brim with relief. Izuku had been overjoyed while his mother was hurting, breaking. He didn't understand the misery in Todoroki's eyes either when he spoke of his mother. Izuku tried to empathize, and he had felt an ache in his chest as his friend told him of his past, but he couldn't understand. He couldn't imagine how it felt to lose his mother. Izuku didn't know what it was like to watch someone leave, knowing that he couldn't stop them, that it was out of his control. He had seen the aftermath of his death on his mother. He had been forced to bear witness to the endless tears that had lasted for weeks and the numbness that settled in afterward. His ears still rang with the haunting echoes of her screams, her desperate pleas. She had begged him to stay, to come back to her. She had begged an empty room for her son to return so she could at least say goodbye. He had watched as she clung to his notebooks, his favorite t-shirt, after his funeral because that was the closest thing she had to holding him. He wanted to scream and cry after seeing his mom in such a state, but he still didn't understand. Empathy didn't mean he could comprehend their pain. Izuku had lost Kaken, but it wasn't the same, he knew. His loss had been slow, gradual. Izuku could see the end result before it happened. He had time to prepare for the end of their friendship. They grew apart, torn in two separate directions, and even after it ended, it wasn't as though Kaken had gone anywhere. He was still there, still a constant in Izuku's life, but he couldn't stay by his side anymore. Izuku was stuck in his heavy shadow, alone. He had lost a friend, but Katsuki Bakugo still haunted him. Izuku was no stranger to pain, but it was of a different sort. His was the hopelessness of crushed, long-forgotten dreams that he had buried a long time ago. The realization that everything he did was futile because no matter how hard he tried, he'd never amount to anything. His pain was that of knowing it was useless for him to try, that everything was so pointless. His was loneliness and shadows and silent tears he shed when no one was looking. His loss was plastered on his face as a bright smile because Izuku had to look like he hadn't already given up. He had to make others happy. He didn't matter. Izuku had been in pain before, but he had never lost someone. That's why he wasn't sure how to deal with Iida. It had only been 2 days since Aizawa gave him the mission of watching over Iida like some sort of twisted guardian angel, and Izuku had no idea what he was doing. Every morning, he would wait in Iida's room until the boy woke up, watch as he went through his morning routine, which was always the same because apparently, Tenyu was very strict and organized. Then Izuku would follow him to school, making sure that he got off at the right station. He never risked getting too close, in fear that Todoroki would see him and ask questions that he couldn't explain. He left Iida in Aizawa's hands at school while Izuku waited patiently on the overpass. When school was over, he'd follow Iida to the hospital to see his brother. The funny thing, Izuku realized after seeing Iida walking to the station with his friend, Uraraka, was that he smiled and acted strong in front of his peers. He played his part well. He smiled and nodded when he was spoken to, never allowing his facade to drop in front of his classmate. But Iida's expression was a mask of calm that hid what Izuku could only describe as raw pain. It was a mixture of pure misery combined with touches of unfathomable rage that made a rather self-destructive concoction. It was only when he was alone that he allowed his smile to slip, but even then, his expression was schooled. It was his navy blue eyes that gave him away. If Izuku hadn't been looking, if he hadn't known what it was like to bury everything inside, he would have definitely missed it. He would have missed the vengeful glimmer that haunted his eyes, the pain that only strengthened his anger. His eyes bled with wrath like a poison, twisting his misery into something ugly, something unspeakable. Izuku didn't want to admit that Aizawa was right, but he also knew that that gleam in Iida's eyes was dangerous. Still, he didn't tell Aizawa about his findings. Not yet. Rage didn't mean that Iida would do anything with it. He would simply observe for now, just like he promised. He followed Iida into the hospital, up the elevator, and into Ingenium's hospital room. Izuku had always admired Ingenium. Maybe not as much as he did All Might or other, more popular heroes, but he still respected the man. It was because Ingenium wasn't concerned about fame that Izuku liked him. He always saved the people that other heroes overlooked, no matter how trivial it may have seemed to the media. Ingenium possessed a true hero's spirit, a spirit that Izuku had hoped every hero could have. Seeing Ingenium now, no. Seeing Tensei Iida in such a horrifying state, it churned Izuku's stomach. The pro-hero, former now, was deathly pale against his hospital bed sheets. Bruises and shallow scrapes marred his skin in ugly patches, bandages wrapped around his limbs. His head, his stomach, concealing the worst of his injuries. He was hooked up to so many machines, Izuku couldn't even begin to count them all. Cords traveled from his body to beeping machines and bags of fluid and blood that hovered around his bedside. Tensei's eyes were shut, deep, dark bags hanging beneath his eyelids. This was the image of a man desperately fighting for his life. Tenya sighed, pulling up a chair beside his brother's bed. Izuku couldn't tell what the hero in training was thinking. He couldn't even begin to understand what sort of things he must be feeling. He had never sat in a hospital room, watching over someone he loved as they wasted away. He had never almost lost someone to death. He was one of the lucky ones, he supposed. "Hey, Tensei," Tenya murmured softly, his voice cracking just a little bit. His strong facade drifted away as he grabbed his brother's hand tightly in his own. Izuku sat in the chair on the other side of Tensei's bed, examining Tenya's expression carefully. The rage was gone now, replaced with only worry and despair. "Today we decided on which hero agency we will be interning at," he continued, his words as fragile as porcelain. Izuku wondered distantly why he forced himself to speak when it was obviously hurting him to do so. "I'll be working under the pro-hero manual starting next week. Oh, and we're picking out hero names soon. I have yet to find an acceptable one for myself, but I'll think of one befitting of the Iida family." Izuku listened intently to every word, even when the boy began to ramble about meaningless nothings. It was obvious that Tenya looked up to his older brother and cared about him very deeply. He wondered if he were in Tenya's shoes, would he be plotting against Stain? Would he be willing to risk everything, his chance at becoming a hero, to get revenge for hurting someone he cared about? The answer was simple. No matter who he put in that hospital bed, whether it be Kaken or Todoroki or his own mother, he would never seek revenge on the person who put them there. The only reason was that he was incapable of doing so. He was quirkless, powerless. The most he would have accomplished was getting himself killed, and that was only if he managed to hunt the vigilante down. A vigilante that not even the police or pro-heroes could find on their own. Izuku Midoriya wasn't a vengeful person by nature, but if someone he cared about was hurt, he'd sacrifice everything he had for them. Tenya Iida was not Izuku, not by any means. He had a powerful engine quirk he could use to fight with. He was a student at UA, high where he had access to resources and support gear. And with the internships coming up, all Iida had to do was find out where Stain's most recent attacks were centralized to find where the vigilante was hiding. After that, all he needed to do was intern under a pro hero in that area, and the rest would be simple. Simple, but it would most definitely end in the death of a UA student. I wish I could help you, to make you see that you're traveling down a dark path, but you can't even hear me, Izuku whispered, his words falling to deaf ears. It was almost tragic how the person that Izuku wanted to talk to the most right now wasn't one of the rare few who could see him. If only he could make Tenya see that what he was doing wasn't right, it would be so much simpler. But alas, this world hated Izuku Midoriya and had to make everything more difficult for him. Izuku brought his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around his shins. If you go through with this, what will happen if you lose? You'll be leaving behind your family, your friends, people who genuinely care about you. Are you willing to throw that all away for a little vendetta? He mused, his voice hiding beneath the constant beeping of Tensei's heart monitor. If you die, you'll probably become like me, or maybe you won't. I don't know what the exact requirements for becoming a ghost are. But as much as I would like to have a new friend, if the cost is your life, I'd much rather we never meet. So don't let your rage consume you. Let your friends at UA help you through this. Just don't let it all go. Don't throw it all away, please. I know you'll regret it. You have such a bright future in front of you. I'm sure you'll make an amazing hero, Tenya, so please, I'm begging you, don't go after Stain. Don't seek vengeance. Don't die for your brother. He wouldn't want that. Your friends wouldn't want that. Please, just leave it to the pro heroes. They can handle Stain. Just focus on being a teenager. Focus on your dreams of becoming a hero. Help your brother recover when he wakes up. Just don't fight Stain. You won't win. He knew it was pointless. He knew that no matter what he said, Tenya would never hear a single word he uttered. He could beg for hours on end, and nothing would change. Izuku couldn't directly influence Tenya's decision with words or actions. He couldn't interfere when it mattered the most. All he could do was watch as Tenya carved his own path out of agony and pain and rage. It wasn't the first time that Izuku felt completely useless, but it was the first time that he was resigned to the fact that he could do absolutely nothing. He'd find a way to help Tenya, even if he could only tell Aizawa what he had found. As long as someone stopped him, it didn't particularly matter if it was Izuku or Aizawa or Uraraka. I'm sorry, Tenya, Izuku sighed, burying his face in his knees. You got stuck with the worst guardian angel in history. Izuku left the boy alone after watching him board a train heading back towards his home. He was confident enough in his calculations to believe that Tenya would wait until his internship to do anything even remotely stupid and life-threatening. At least, that's what Izuku would do if he was him. He didn't board the train with Tenya. He didn't want to go back to the apartment where Aizawa was probably waiting for him. Not yet, even if the sun was beginning to set over the horizon, dyeing the world in hues of red and purple. There were too many thoughts in his head that needed to be silenced first. Izuku strolled down a random, unfamiliar sidewalk in an even more unfamiliar neighborhood. He silently cursed himself. One would think he would have learned by now, considering all his past experiences. But no, Izuku was an explorer now. A directionally challenged explorer who couldn't ask for help because no one around could hear him. Wonderful, though, he knew that it wasn't that big of a deal. Nothing bad could happen to him in the dark. And even if he was attacked by a villain that could see him, he wouldn't get hurt. It would just be another annoyance. Izuku sighed, slowing to a stop in front of what seemed to be another hospital. And he had to wonder if he just went around in circles for the past 20 minutes. He supposed it didn't matter all that much. He was looking for a way to kill time anyway. He just wished that he didn't find the hospital again. He hated hospitals more than anything. Blaring sirens erupted from nearby, startling Izuku from the beginnings of a daydream. An ambulance came barreling out from the hospital, casting the growing darkness in red and white light. The sirens painfully grated Izuku's ears, and he withheld the urge to flinch at the ear-splitting noise. Their screeching crescendoed to a high-pitched blare as they passed, their light almost blinding him. His eyes were glued to the flashing red and white as the ambulance rumbled down the street before disappearing into the darkness. He didn't notice when his hands began to shake. Falling. Izuku shook his head, his fingers tangling in his hair violently. If you think you'll have a quirk in your next life, go take a swan dive off the roof. The sirens were loud that day too. Cool. He was scared. He never liked heights. He was scared of falling. Eku. They knew that. That didn't stop them. He didn't want. Deku. Izuku's eyes shot up to see familiar, worried heterochromia eyes gazing down at him. They were unbelievably wide with might have been surprise, might have been fear. Izuku was too far gone to properly tell anymore. Todoroki. Izuku gasped, his fingers loosening from his curls only slightly. The red and white-haired boy nodded, his lips parted. Yeah, Todoroki breathed, his hands rising up to gently wrap around Izuku's wrists to detangle them from his hair. His movements were incredibly slow, like he was trapped in some sort of daze or approaching a terrified animal. Yeah, Deku, it's me. Izuku's eyes roamed his friend's body from the top of his dual-colored hair to the white t-shirt and jean jacket he wore to his wide blue and gray eyes. He couldn't tell whether Todoroki's hands were warm or cold. All he could feel was the gentle pressure as the boy held his wrists before he could tear himself apart like he was tempted to do. His scars were burning again, and had Todoroki not been holding his wrists, he may have torn all the skin from his forearms. It would have been an unsuccessful attempt, but at the moment, Izuku didn't mind trying. "Are you all right? What are you doing out here so late?" Todoroki questioned, seeming to look him over for any wounds or injuries with a trained eye. Slowly, he lowered both his and Izuku's hands down to their sides, but he didn't let go. Izuku glanced over his shoulder, searching for traces of the ambulance that had gone by. When he turned back to face his friend, he couldn't scrounge up the will to offer him a smile. He didn't even feel scared now that they were finally face to face. The confrontation that he had been postponing was rearing its head, but Izuku didn't feel afraid. He didn't feel much of anything, just hollow. He almost spat out those cursed words, almost let slip a meaningless "I'm fine," but then he remembered what Todoroki had asked of him the last time they met. He couldn't lie when it was so obviously not true. So Izuku shook his head and leaned forward until his forehead rested on Todoroki's chest. He felt Todoroki jump at the sudden contact, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he released one of Izuku's arms, his hand coming up to hesitantly pat his head. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Izuku could feel his breath and heartbeat rumbling in his chest, reverberating against his skin. It was almost soothing. "I'm sorry," Izuku whispered, clenching his eyes shut as he burrowed deeper, if possible, into Todoroki's chest. Izuku's free hand gripped onto Todoroki's shirt desperately, as if that was the only thing that was anchoring him to his sanity. His friend's hand stilled in his hair, his body tensing beneath Izuku's touch. I'm sorry. Todoroki pushed him away, just enough to see his face. There were no tears, as Todoroki probably believed there to be, but his head did ache like a hammer was constantly slamming into his skull. He knew that he should have been crying, but the tears never appeared. They were buried somewhere deep beneath the surface, in a place that Izuku couldn't remember. Though, that was probably the intention. For as long as Izuku had been dead, he had been burying everything in a place where he could never find again. He left no marker, didn't bother to count the steps he took to get to such a dark place. He allowed the memory to fade from his mind. "Why are you apologizing? You have nothing to be sorry for," Todoroki reassured him, his hands cupping Izuku's shoulders. Izuku gazed up at him from beneath lowered lashes, but he couldn't say a word, not yet. "What's wrong? You can talk to me, Deku." He sounded so sure, so gentle that it made Izuku's chest hurt a little. Here Todoroki was, being so heart-wrenchingly genuine to someone like Izuku despite not knowing much about him, despite having a fight not so long ago. Receiving such kindness was something Izuku had never been familiar with. "I'm not really good at this whole friendship thing," he whispered, fearing, for a moment, that Todoroki didn't hear him. A pathetic laugh escaped his lips as he hung his head. "I'm sorry, Todoroki. I think you're probably better at it than I am," Todoroki insisted, his grip on Izuku's tightening a fraction. "If this is about what happened at the sports festival, it's not your fault. I wasn't angry at you, Deku. I was angrier at myself for pushing the issue. I knew that it was an uncomfortable topic to talk about, but I still asked anyway." Izuku bit his bottom lip with enough force to break the skin. "But I still lied. It's okay. I understand why you did. I think I owe you an explanation or two." "You don't." I want to though," Izuku said, nodding to gather up what little courage he had left within his tiny body. Even if this all ended in failure and he lost Todoroki as a friend, it would be all right. Izuku was still the same old Deku he always was. It was understandable that people would abandon him. But if he was able to, he'd like to still be around Todoroki. He wanted to be honest with him, as honest as his little courage allowed him to be. Even if it wasn't the full truth, even if he couldn't admit what truly happened all those months ago, if he could tell Todoroki even a sliver of the truth, it would be all right. Everything would be fine. Izuku would be fine. It would be fine. "Okay," Todoroki sighed, a rare smile gracing his lips. "But we really shouldn't talk here, it's getting late." Izuku tilted his head upwards to see the contemplative gleam in his friend's eyes. "Do you want to break into my house and talk about it?" Izuku couldn't stop the huff of laughter that forced its way out of his throat. Everything would be fine. It was like a mantra echoing in his mind. All right. The truth was difficult. There were so many little aspects, so many twists and turns that Izuku wasn't sure if he could properly convey them all. While there were things that would be simple to say that would only bring them closer together as friends, there were also dark paths that even Izuku was too scared to walk down. Dark paths that led down to the nights he clutched his hair in desperation for the nightmares to stop. Nights where his blood ran thickly down his skin, staining his clothes a sickening scarlet color. That truth was one he wished he could keep hidden to the very end. As much as Izuku hated to admit it, sometimes it was easier to lie, even if the end result was a bed of tangled thorns, than to tell a truth one was not ready to give. But Izuku didn't follow Todoroki to his house to lie to his face all over again. No matter how hard it was, even if he had to force the words from his throat, Izuku would tell the truth. All the tiny slivers of truth that he could offer Todoroki, he would give. So, despite the pit of dread growing in his stomach, Izuku followed his friend down the empty hallways of his home. No one else was around as far as Izuku could see. Todoroki explained earlier that his brother was away at college, his sister was staying somewhere overnight with her students for a school field trip, and Endeavor was away on some mission in another town. So it was just the two of them in the house. But as Izuku stole glances around as they traveled to Todoroki's room, he came upon a cold realization. The entire house was scarce of family photos, of any personal touches that made this the Todoroki home. There were many traditional Japanese decorations everywhere that Izuku laid his eyes on, but there were very little signs that someone actually lived here. The rooms were drenched with a certain kind of loneliness that reminded Izuku of the time he returned home only to find that it was utterly abandoned. Izuku continued on silently behind Todoroki with a newfound weight in his chest. It wasn't long before he was sitting in his friend's room, which was just as plain and bare as the rest of the house. There was only a futon layered with blank white sheets and a small table pushed against the wall that was most likely used as a desk. There was a bookshelf resting in the corner of the room, its shelves filled with dozens of paperbacks. But even so, there was no evidence that Izuku could find that this room belonged to a teenage boy. It was impeccably clean, and no personal items were left out. It was like Todoroki was just passing through, that he wasn't planning on staying. Izuku wouldn't want to stay in the same house as someone who hurt him either. Sit wherever you'd like, Todoroki hummed quietly, gesturing around his sparsely decorated room. The boy sat, his back leaning against the wall beside the pillows on his futon. Izuku took the spot directly across from him. This was really happening. Things had settled and all that needed to happen now was for Izuku to talk. He was especially good at mumbling his thoughts carelessly. How different could this possibly be? Izuku's eyes fell to the tatami floors, his eyes tracing imaginary patterns in the material. Silence festered between them, slowly choking out whatever courage Izuku had gathered up from their short walk down the corridor. Todoroki was obviously waiting for him to make the first move because it would be his own secrets that he'd be spilling. Todoroki wasn't someone who would push someone to reveal the truth. He felt his friend's eyes on him the entire time. But there was no judgment or rush being forced upon him, just patience. What were you doing out by the hospital earlier? Izuku wondered, figuring it was as good a place as any to start. One usually dipped their toes in the water before diving in head first. Todoroki's fingers rose unconsciously to the red scar encircling his left eye, a small, almost content smile glimmering on his face. "I was visiting my mother," he murmured, so softly that Izuku almost didn't hear him. A grin split across his face. "That's great, Todoroki," he exclaimed, bringing his knees up to his chest to wrap his arms around them. "It's been a while since you've last seen her." "Yeah. Is she doing well?" He nodded, and Izuku was sure that he had never seen Todoroki so openly expressive, not even around him. His mismatched eyes were almost literally twinkling with joy. It calmed Izuku's fried nerves to see his friend so happy. "She's getting better. It will still be a little while before she can get checked out though. I'm really happy for you." The red and white-haired boy finally caught Izuku's gaze, some of the light dying out as a question flickered in his eyes. "What were you doing outside the hospital then, Deku? Were you visiting someone too?" he inquired, cocking his head in such a way that his hair fell over the scar painting his left side. Izuku's throat tightened, a million half-truths bubbling on his tongue. "Kind of," he stated, resting his chin on his scarred knees. "I was watching over someone for a friend." Todoroki's gaze momentarily darkened, a frown obliterating the content grin he wore previously. Then he hesitated, his lips pursing before slowly continuing on. "Why were you having a panic attack outside? Did something happen?" Izuku could repress the flinch that shuddered throughout his body. Even now, the sirens still echoed painfully in his ears, the flashing lights still dancing behind his eyelids. He curled in a little tighter around himself before speaking. "Nothing really happened, per se," he began, his voice quivering slightly as his nails dug into his shins. "It's sort of ridiculous now that I think about it. Why would I get all worked up over an ambulance driving by? It's just an emergency vehicle that was sent out to do its job. But it reminded me of something that happened a little while back and I panicked. Then I couldn't breathe, which is really strange for someone in my predicament. And it kept getting worse and worse." "Deku," Todoroki's voice shattered through the beginning of another rambling session that would have ended in hysterics had he not stopped him. Izuku bit his lip, rocking back and forth gently. There were three options he could take now. He could either tell Todoroki the honest truth about what occurred that day long before they met each other, long before they became friends and got to know one another. He could tell him a truth that he had only told one other, Or he could lie through his teeth. He could spin pretty webs of lies until they suffocated him. He could convince Todoroki that he was perfectly fine and drown himself in guilt all the while. Or Izuku could run away, sprint down the hallway, and fumble down the stairs until he reached outside. He could end this all now and hide away in Aizawa's apartment for the next few decades if he lasted that long. He could disappear now and spare Todoroki the pain he'd probably feel later. Nothing good could come from being friends with a ghost. But Izuku wasn't that desperate yet. He wasn't going to run, but he couldn't help that the thought popped into his mind. Slivers of truth, what to leave out, what to omit, what to twist. It was always such a complicated procedure, one of which Izuku was growingly getting better at. Izuku sighed and allowed his head to loll from side to side as he gathered the broken splinters of courage he had left. It was almost a year ago. 9 months actually. I've been counting the days for some reason. It was supposed to be just another normal day. I woke up, ate breakfast, waved my mom goodbye, went to school just like every other day. But then something changed. Izuku felt a small, pathetic huff of laughter building up in his chest, one that he couldn't choke back down. I was bullied a lot back then because I was quirkless, and that meant I was useless. It meant I couldn't do anything substantial or amazing. That day, someone told me to take a swan dive actually off the roof, and maybe then, in my next life, I'd get a quirk. Izuku didn't miss how Todoroki's breath hitched dangerously at that part, didn't miss the way his eyes widened or his expression crumbled. He didn't openly acknowledge it, but he saw it. He just couldn't bear to see the horror that flooded in his gaze. So Izuku shut his eyes as though he was listening to some far-off lullaby. This was it. This was the moment when the truth had to be reined in, where little lies and half-truths had to be mixed in. Otherwise, Todoroki would never look at him the same way again. A sort of bitterness rose from Izuku's stomach, his entire body tingling with regret, but he couldn't let him know. Not yet, not now. I had no intention of following their advice, really I didn't. I didn't want to die, and quite frankly, I'm not a fan of heights, so I wasn't about to climb up all those stairs to the roof. Besides, the door's always locked for safety reasons. Izuku suddenly frowned, his eyes fluttering open. He couldn't seem to remember how the door to the room was open that day, but he knew that it was. He remembered how it creaked loudly as the door was shoved, rather violently, open. Countless visions replayed in his mind, but all he could remember was pleas and cries and screaming and rough hands that grabbed at him. I was in an accident of sorts soon after, Izuku continued on, his voice strained as the memories resurfaced, the same half-truth that he told Aizawa. I don't remember much of what happened. All I know is that I survived the accident itself, somehow, but in the ambulance. There were severe complications. I can't remember what exactly happened after that. I think I was asleep for a while, maybe a few days. All I know is that I woke up, and I was like this. Your quirk was activated by trauma, Todoroki whispered, his voice almost as tight as Izuku's. Izuku wished he could say that it wasn't a quirk, that it wasn't exactly an accident that got him killed. He wished he could comfort the despondency raging in his friend's eyes, but he wasn't sure how to. Izuku swallowed against the lump forming in his throat, his eyes rising to meet Todoroki's. Do you remember when you asked me if I was in a hero course? He asked, his words feeble. Todoroki's hands tightened into fists in his lap, but he nodded all the same. Izuku allowed a deceptively bright smile to cross his features. I've been told my entire life that I would never amount to anything, that I was worthless, that someone who didn't have a quirk couldn't become a hero. Eventually, I had no choice but to believe them. Especially after the accident. It left me useless in a lot of respects. Now, I don't think I'm physically able to become a hero anymore. The silence that festered between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just heavy, thick with spilled secrets that Izuku thought he would take to the grave. There were a few that he had omitted, and he swore that it was for Todoroki's sake, but he knew that it was more for his own. A small sprinkle of selfishness was all it was. Todoroki leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes never leaving Izuku's. I don't think you're useless, Todoroki murmured, his jaw tensely clenched. You're always there to comfort me or listen to me rant about endeavor. You're always there, always cheering me on. How can you be useless when you've helped me so much? Izuku wished he could cry, wished the ache at his temples would dissipate and tears would run down his face. He wished he could show Todoroki just how much he needed those words, even if it was too late for him. But he didn't know how. Instead, he could only count the scars scattered across his kneecaps. He didn't tell Todoroki about the endless days he tried to comfort his crying mother as she held onto his cracked picture like some lifeline. He didn't tell him about the times he tried to wrap his arms around her to alleviate the pain. He didn't tell him about the nights he sat curled up in his bedroom with his hands over his ears during the weeks before he ran away. I'm called Deku for a reason. He said it calmly, merely stating a fact that everyone should know. Because in all honesty, everyone who knew Izuku knew what he was. He had accepted that truth a long time ago. But Todoroki didn't seem to like the way he spoke, judging by the way his lips curled back in some sort of growl. But your real name isn't actually Deku, Todoroki responded, but there was no anger in his voice despite the dark expression he wore. There was no hint of a question at all. He already knew that, probably for longer than Izuku thought. Izuku froze, his joints locking up almost against his will, but soon he relaxed, a pathetic excuse for a smile slipping across his face. Honest. Be honest. No, it isn't. Then what is it? Izuku remembered broken pieces of stone, an empty coffin, flowers made of ashes. He remembered bruises and screaming in darkness so thick it was suffocating. He remembered fire and explosions and fists. Izuku. He tried not to choke on the syllables, but he still had to force his lips to shape his name. The word was ripped from his tongue, leaving behind the bitter taste of ashes and dust. For a moment, for a heart-wrenching moment, Izuku wondered if he would regret telling Todoroki that little truth. He wondered if he took the first step in destroying what pretty, deceptive world he had built around himself. Todoroki licked his lips, his throat bobbing as he swallowed harshly. "You're the boy Bakugo was talking about," he said, perhaps more to himself rather than Izuku. His eyes narrowed as he gazed into the space between them that suddenly felt like miles and miles. "You're that childhood friend he mentioned." Izuku scratched at his cheek, remembering how Aizawa had once told him that Bakugo had brought his name up during class. "Probably. We grew up together, but that's about it," he muttered, ignoring the dull throb that echoed in his chest. "If that was true, you wouldn't be scared of him." Izuku wasn't sure when he shot to his feet, but suddenly he was looking down at Todoroki, panic blurring his vision. "I am not scared of Kaken," he exclaimed, his voice louder than he ever intended it to be, though it wasn't as if anyone besides them were in the house anyway. And even then, Todoroki was the only one who would hear him. Despite the volume, there was no anger, no rage in his tone. Todoroki rose to his feet, and Izuku cursed the height difference between them when he was forced to look up at his friend. "Then why did you hide from him at the sports festival?" he demanded, his brow furrowing. "Because I'm dead and he can't see me, but he can see you." Izuku swallowed the thought down, his hands clasping in front of him. "Katsuki hates me. I didn't want to start a fight with him," he said, a bit too quickly to be completely believable. "I didn't want to start any drama, so I avoided him. That's it. I'm not scared of Katsuki." The silence was deafening. It only served to remind Izuku of why, exactly, he was so hesitant to tell the truth in the first place. He didn't want to make things difficult between them. He just wanted a gentle, uncomplicated friendship where he could spend hours sitting by a lake talking about nothing and everything all at once. It wasn't supposed to be this deep. He certainly didn't want a shallow relationship with Todoroki. But he wasn't supposed to be spilling his deepest, darkest secrets to him. Secrets that he hadn't even told Kaken. But of course, Izuku got emotionally invested. God, he was so predictable. Now he cared. About Todoroki. About their relationship. About whether or not he hurt him. He was so undeniably screwed. "Are you a villain?" Todoroki abruptly asked, shattering the silence more violently than if he had shot a glass window with a bullet. Izuku's jaw dropped. "What? No, I'm not." "Are you a vigilante?" "No." "Are you some sort of spy sent to gather information on UA staff or students?" he inquired, his voice carefully blank, just like his expression. Izuku shook his head. "Of course not. Where is all this coming from?" Todoroki sighed in what might have been relief. "If you don't have any ulterior motives, then I still want you by my side," he stated, shoving his hands awkwardly in his pockets. It may have been the lighting, but Izuku swore he could see a hint of pint tinting Todoroki's cheeks. "As my friend." Izuku blinked slowly, still processing his words. He was worse than screwed. There was still one truth that Izuku wanted to say. If this was the path that Todoroki wanted to take, if he wanted them to be friends, he had to know what he was signing up for. Izuku had been so selfish not to say so from the very beginning, but he hadn't expected their friendship to grow so far. He hadn't believed that Shadow Todoroki would be anyone more than a stranger to him. Look where they were now. He had to tell him this last truth. He had to tell him that he was dead, that he wasn't sure how long he would be sticking around. He had to warn him not to get too attached before it was too late, because if Izuku disappeared, whether it be his own choice or some sort of mystical ghost crap, Todoroki had to know why beforehand. He didn't want to hurt him. He didn't want to leave. And, God, if the pure naivety and childishness of those thoughts didn't kill Izuku, the irony would. "Todoroki," he began, his voice trailing off into uncertainty. Todoroki's brow lifted a fraction, curiosity and an innocent gleam beaming in his eyes. He would never expect what Izuku would say next. It wasn't even a possibility that ran through his mind. As far as Todoroki was aware, ghosts didn't exist. "What is it?" Izuku's throat closed up, the words withering away on his tongue. He smiled, pressure building at his temples. "I want you at my side too." Coward. He was such a coward. The nightmares were worse that night than ever before. By the time Izuku returned to Aizawa's apartment, it was already the early hours of the morning, the sun only beginning to bleach the sky with reds and pinks and slivers of light. Aizawa must have been asleep by now, judging by the heavy silence that encompassed the apartment. Even Fuyu and Miss Fluffernugget were curled up in the living room, resting peacefully. All the while Izuku wanted to tear his hair out and bang his head against a wall until it stopped hurting. But he had to be quiet. He couldn't afford to wake up Aizawa. Aizawa was depending on him. He couldn't be weak. He couldn't be a nuisance. So he scratched at his skin in the silence of the early morning, letting the dark thoughts that had been clinging to him in. He suffered without making a single cry for help. He replayed his and Todoroki's earlier conversation in his head, letting it fester until his body prickled with tiny pins and needles. He could see his skin beginning to flicker in the light filtering in through the window. And it was just another reminder that he didn't really exist. He was just a figment of something else, someone else. Coward, you're nothing but a coward. A coward and a liar. You couldn't even tell him the most important truth. Weak. He'll hate you when he finds out. And he will find out. Don't think you can hide it forever. Izuku collapsed on the couch, curling his knees to his chest. I know that, he hissed through clenched teeth. It's not like I expected this to end with sunshine and rainbows. This was never going to have a happy ending. He knew that. Perhaps better than anyone, he knew how this was going to end. That was why he didn't fight it when his mind was drowning in blood and the horrific whistling of the wind that sounded too much like laughter. When the internships for Aizawa's class began, Izuku knew that he should have warned the underground hero about his suspicions regarding Tenya Iida's plan, but something seemed to butcher the words before they could leave his tongue. Maybe it was because he wasn't entirely sure that Iida would be stupid and suicidal enough to go after Stain during his internship. It wasn't as if the boy was writing his plans down in a notebook. And he certainly didn't have one of those tracking boards like Izuku saw in the movies that were covered with pictures and red string and sticky notes. It would have been much more convenient if Iida were more like how Izuku was when he was still alive. He wrote every thought down on paper. But alas, whatever Iida was planning, if he was planning anything in the first place, was all stuck in his head, beneath cold, navy blue eyes. Though it was more likely that the reason was something else, something that Izuku didn't want to even consider would come from his own mind. He didn't care. He didn't care if Iida was throwing himself headfirst into an uphill battle that would end in bloodshed. He didn't care that a life was on the line or that it was Todoroki's classmate or Aizawa's student. Izuku just didn't care. The only reason he was doing this in the first place was because Aizawa requested it of him. He owed Aizawa a lot too much, especially since he allowed Izuku to stay in his apartment. He offered Izuku someone to talk to, a companionship that he desperately needed. He held no emotional attachment to the kid. He didn't care if he lived or died. That thought should have scared him. He knew that it should matter if a boy his age was going to die, that he should be doing this for more than repaying a debt. This was a life on the line. He should feel something. Yet, no matter how deeply he dug, there was nothing. Even if he thought about how Iida and he could have probably been friends if Izuku hadn't died, it didn't help. In the end, it was just a job. Izuku couldn't scrounge up the emotions to panic over the fact that he felt nothing for the boy. But it was easier for him to tell himself that it was because he wasn't sure rather than admit that he was losing something vital. Izuku knew it was a lie. He was sure the boy was going to go after Stain when Izuku learned that Iida's hero name would be Ingenium. To most, it would seem like a passing of the torch, a way to carry on his brother's legacy since Ingenium could no longer be a hero. Maybe if Izuku wasn't aware of the rage building within Iida, he might have believed that. Maybe if Izuku was innocent and naive, he would have believed that. But he wasn't. He didn't take up the name Ingenium to carry on a legacy. He did it for revenge. For petty, wrathful revenge on the man who took his brother's future from him. Eventually, Izuku no longer had to worry about whether or not he should inform Aizawa of his findings because, once again, Izuku found himself sitting in his empty classroom while his students were eating lunch. It was almost the perfect replica of a few days ago when Aizawa first gave him this special mission. He's definitely angry, Izuku admitted, his eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling as he sat upon a desk in the front row. Very angry, almost bordering on Kaken-level angry. But he's not letting it out at all. He's keeping it all to himself. It's a very self-destructive habit that might cause him to do some very stupid things. Aizawa sighed as though he was expecting all of this. Do you think he's going to go after Stain? He asked, but Izuku suspected that he already knew the answer. Aizawa may have seemed indifferent and lazy, but his intuition about his students' safety was unparalleled. I think that he's tempted to, he hummed, recalling the way Iida desperately clasped his brother's hand in the hospital after Ingenium woke up. At the very least, he's thinking about gutting the man in his dreams. But I'm not a mind reader. I can't say for sure if he's actually going to go through with it, and I have no idea if he'll even be able to find Stain. After all, he's evaded police and hero capture on multiple occasions. I doubt a student will be lucky enough to track him down. Aizawa was silent for a long while. mulling over his words. Problem children, all of them. He spat almost like a curse, but there was no venom whatsoever in his voice, just exhaustion. Izuku allowed a weak smile to cross his face as he lowered his gaze to the poor teacher. They just can't behave for more than 5 minutes. Izuku huffed a breathless laugh. We all know you love them, Aizawa, he teased, earning a half-hearted glare from the man. He merely grunted in response. Another lull in their conversation followed his comment. And Izuku couldn't remember a time when it had ever been this awkward between him and the hero. Even when they first met and Izuku was breaking down in the man's living room, it hadn't been this quiet. There had always been something to ease the heavy atmosphere. Izuku had to wonder if the change was his fault. You already knew, right? Izuku blinked at Aizawa's abrupt question that sliced through the silence like a knife through butter. He cocked his head, noticing the way that his dark gaze bore into his eyes with a seriousness that was becoming all too familiar. I'm not sure what you're talking ab. You already knew that it was dragon, he clarified, interrupting Izuku before he could even finish his thought. Aizawa straightened from where he was leaning against his podium, and Izuku was almost tempted to bolt right out the window. He had seen that look on countless teachers' faces before, and it was never a good sign. Instead, Izuku chewed his bottom lip, kicking his feet lazily in front of him. So the police found that much out? Huh, he murmured, his voice quieter than he had intended it to be. I received a text during break, Aizawa explained, shortly. Do you realize what that means, problem child? Unfortunately, Izuku knew a bit too well. He nodded. His body was most likely in the hands of the League of Villains, and that was not a comforting thought. None of his thoughts seemed to be these days. Can we not talk about that yet? I don't want to think about that right now. We should just focus on keeping Iida safe, and we can deal with everything else later. Aizawa sighed, but he nodded all the same. It would seem he didn't want to think of the implications either. Izuku just wanted to focus on protecting Tenya and not the fact that everything was starting to become numb. But Aizawa didn't need to know that. Something terrible was going to happen. That's all that Izuku could think about as he walked alongside Iida while he patrolled Hosu's streets with the pro-hero manual. It wasn't like there was trouble brewing in the air. In fact, it was peaceful. There weren't many people wandering about, but those who were meandering on the streets were probably heading home from work. The night was quiet, but despite the tranquility, something was setting off Izuku's nerves, setting his scars ablaze with irritation. Something was screaming at him to run away. That danger was coming. Izuku did what he did best. He ignored it. Instead, his eyes trailed across the darkness haunting the alleyways they passed on their patrol. He wasn't searching for anything in particular, just keeping an eye out. He saw a few glowing eyes of stray cats hiding in the shadows, maybe even a dog, but he wasn't sure. It was too late to properly make out the shapes dancing in the darkness. It may have been his mind playing tricks on him, but Izuku swore that his eyes caught a flash of blood red down one particular alleyway. Manuel and Iida were talking about something, but Izuku was tuning them out. There was something down that alley, something that was screaming at him. His body involuntarily shivered despite the fact that he couldn't feel cold anymore. His senses were urging him to keep moving. Get away from the entranceway of the alley, and leave it all behind. When the streets became filled with horrified shrieks and cries, Izuku's attention was snatched away to see the chaos erupting around him. Smoke was rising into the sky, followed only by the pluming flames of bright orange fire. The night sky was illuminated in disaster and pure terror as beasts descended from above, attacking everything and everyone in sight. Shouts filled the air as pro-heroes launched into action. But Izuku recognized the monsters that were appearing in the sky. Namu, Izuku sighed before turning back to Iida, or at least where Iida had been. Neither he or Manuel were anywhere to be found. They must have left when Izuku was distracted by the Namu. Aizawa was going to kill him again if Iida got hurt on his watch. Izuku scanned the area around him, certain that Iida couldn't have gone too far in such a short amount of time. But then again, he had a quirk called Engine that literally made him have super speed, and Izuku had no idea where that boy could have gone. He hadn't been listening to Manuel at all, but Izuku had a pretty good idea what Iida was planning. Swearing to himself, Izuku launched himself headfirst into the alleyway where he saw the flash of red despite how much he wanted to turn the other way. He had no idea where he was going, had no idea what turns and twists Iida may have taken, but he had to try. It was times like these when he cursed how directionally challenged he was. This was an important mission. All he had to do was prevent a teenager from committing vigilantism. How hard could it be to protect one student? Very hard apparently. It wasn't long until a different sort of cry filled the air, one full of pain, of panic. Izuku had never run faster than that moment. Before he knew what was happening, he was skidding into some back alley with 3 figures hiding in the shadows. 2 were on the ground. One was standing tall with something gleaming above his head. The flash of red. Stain. Of course Iida would defy all expectations and actually find the vigilante. There wasn't much Izuku could do. Aizawa was nowhere near Hosu, and it wasn't as though Izuku could just run around and ask for help. Even if the heroes could see him, Nama were attacking. They had to prioritize the safety of the citizens and evacuate before there were any casualties. The only person around who was in any shape to save Iida right now was Izuku, and that could only end in failure. Mission, think about the mission. But suddenly, Stain's movements froze, the tip of the blade hovering mere inches above Iida's defenseless back. Slowly, as though he was moving through a daze, the vigilante raised his head, his wide, beady eyes connecting with Izuku's from across the alley. Fear licked up Izuku's spine even though he knew that he couldn't be hurt anymore. There was just something wild and wicked in the man's gaze that terrified him. A smirk, maybe a grimace, stretched across his face, revealing 2 white teeth with what looked like blood staining his gums. Izuku felt his body flicker in response, but he remained rooted in place. Why was it always the weird ones that could see him? He wasn't even surprised at this point. As long as he could prolong this interaction and give Iida more time to save himself, it'd be fine. You should get a move on, kid. You don't want to see what happens next, the man hissed, his voice low and gravelly. It grated against his ears almost painfully, but Izuku forced his expression to stay stoic. Though the words should have held the weight of an underlying threat, there was none, from what Izuku knew of Stain's ideology. He only went after fake heroes who were more concerned about their image than saving people. Izuku obviously wasn't a hero, which meant that Stain probably wanted nothing to do with him unless he got in his way. He could practically see the confusion radiating from Iida as he tried his best to turn to see who was behind him. It seemed that he was having difficulty moving his body. Izuku distantly wondered if it was due to some sort of paralysis affecting him or if he was just injured. That's an interesting idea, but I'm afraid I'll have to become an annoyance. After all, I really can't have you killing a poor kid who can't even fight back. What sort of person would that make me if I just left? Izuku mused, his hands clasping behind his back as he cocked his head curiously. He wasn't sure where this bravado was coming from, but he was glad for it. It hid how close he was to letting his fear consume him. Stain sneered. This is a pro-hero in the making that's already been corrupted with a twisted mentality. He chose to attack me for revenge rather than save the fallen pro-hero beside him. He spat, his words containing so much poison that Izuku could almost feel it coursing through his veins. Izuku stole a glance towards the other prone figure leaning against the brick wall of the alley. He seemed to be unconscious, but otherwise unhurt, except for a blossom of blood growing from his shoulder. It didn't seem lethal though. He'll just become another despicable hero in this society, one tainted with bloodlust and hatred. To be completely fair, you did permanently paralyze his older brother, crushing any hope he had of continuing his hero career, Izuku countered, scratching the back of his head. He really shouldn't be sassing a vigilante with a body count and a blade hovering over someone he was supposed to be protecting. But to be honest, he couldn't help it. And now, it seems like you've paralyzed the younger brother as well. How are you doing that, by the way? Is it some sort of poison coated on your swords and daggers, or is it perhaps your quirk? Does it have something to do with blood consumption? Is that why no one's caught you? I suppose it is easier to kill a stagnant target than a moving one after all. Izuku cut off his train of thought before it could continue. Oh, I'm rambling again. Always getting off topic. Silly me, it's a terrible habit of mine, but I just have such a fascination with quirks. Stain's wild eyes narrowed, his body straightening, muscles still poised to attack despite his seemingly lowered guard. Are you another hero in training? A friend of his perhaps? Stain murmured, mostly to himself, but Izuku still heard. No, I don't recognize your face from the reports on the USJ incident. And I don't think you participated in the sports festival. So, who are you, kid? Izuku grinned as brightly and innocently as he was able to in these circumstances. I'm no one in particular, just your friendly, neighborhood idiot with far too much time on his hands and an almost unhealthy obsession with quirk analysis. Yet you're risking your life to save him. Izuku wanted to laugh. What can I say? He shrugged, taking a few cautious steps forward. I really hate bullies who pick on people weaker than them. You don't need to protect me. You should get out of here. It's too dangerous. Iida called out from the ground, speaking for the first time since Izuku intervened in his apparent execution. Izuku blinked, his gaze falling toward the paralyzed boy lying prone on the concrete. Was he just yelling at a general presence he thought was behind him, or did he genuinely hear Izuku? From what Izuku had observed over the last few days, Iida couldn't see him at all, so there was no way. Then again, weird things always seem to happen to him at the most inopportune times. You should listen to him, kid, Stain growled, raising his sword up once more. You can't win. Izuku focused on stabilizing his body as much as possible. He only had one shot at this, and if he failed, Iida would die. Neither can you. His body charged forward as the blade was coming down once again. Izuku couldn't feel Stain beneath him, but he did hear the surprised huff of breath as he tackled him to the ground. His sword grazed Izuku's back on the way down, but there was no pain. No indication of injury. A ghost couldn't get stabbed after all. Izuku shoved himself away from the vigilante before he could collapse on top of him, retreating back to who was staring up at him with wide, navy blue eyes and parted lips. Izuku didn't know what was going on or even why this was happening. This wasn't how things were yesterday or even 5 minutes ago, but he didn't exactly have the time to contemplate what was happening to him. I'll distract him. When you get the chance, send your location to your friends, he ordered quickly, kneeling down by the student's head. Blood was pooling beneath his arm, but he didn't seem too injured. Iida's eyes narrowed. It's too dangerous, you have to. I'm the safest one here. Genius, Izuku snapped, rising back to his feet. I don't have a phone, so I need you to do this, okay? Okay, you're a civilian. Izuku scowled, turning his back on the boy. Technicalities, he huffed, watching as Stain snapped back to his feet, his teeth bared like a rabid animal. You suicidal brat. The words froze Izuku's joints, and for a moment, he could only gaze at the man. Maybe he could convince Aizawa to punch this man in the face as well. Izuku didn't think it would take much. Tenya knew that there was a good chance that he was going to die if fought Stain. But it didn't seem to matter that much to him until the vigilante's blade was balanced over his back. He thought that even if he lost, as long as he took Stain down with him, he could deal with the consequences. As long as he avenged Tensei, his brother, everything else was infinitesimal. In the end, he thought that it would be worth it. He wasn't expecting to be saved from his idiocy. He wasn't expecting to be saved at all after what he'd done. He'd been so foolish, trying to get revenge while he was nearly powerless, and now he was paying for it, probably with his life, if not his future as a hero. He certainly wasn't expecting his salvation to come in the form of a young boy, most likely younger than Tenya himself. At least, Tenya could only assume that the boy was younger than him by his appearance. The way he spoke to Stain, a vigilante known across the board as the hero killer, as though he wasn't afraid of a murderer, begged to differ. There was no fear, even at the risk that he would die if he confronted Stain. Tenya had to wonder if the boy was stupidly brave or just plain stupid. When the boy tackled the vigilante, Tenya decided right then and there that he was just stupid. The boy was a civilian, forced to play hero because of his idiotic pipe dream of getting revenge for his older brother. He shouldn't have been the one standing up to Stain. And neither was Tenya, but right now, the boy's life was at risk because of his selfish desires. He couldn't let someone else, especially someone younger than Tenya, die because of him. There was really no other choice right now than to follow the boy's orders. Tenya assumed the paralysis was Stain's quirk, something to do with consuming his blood as the boy had guessed from the very beginning. But he had no idea how long it would last for. Until the effects wore off, the most he could do was watch as Stain rose to his feet and the boy preparing to defend Tenya. If the boy used his quirk in this fight, it would be considered vigilantism. Tenya pushed that thought aside for now. You know, everyone always says that to me, the boy mused in his sing-song voice. It was truly the only way for Tenya to describe it, the gentle, almost carefree tone like he was talking about the weather or a distant dream. I'm starting to wonder if I'm leaving the wrong impression on people. I don't mean to give off the vibe that I want to kill myself, but I suppose it happens to the best of us, right, Stain? The vigilante growled, twirling his sword in his hands. You sure talk a lot for someone who's about to die. Tenya was sure he was hallucinating, but he could have sworn the boy smirked. About to die, the boy repeated, a bitter laugh hanging off every word. I didn't know you were into jokes. You learn something new every day. Who are you? The boy took a few calculated steps away from Tenya, as if ensuring that he would be out of harm's way should a fight break out. A dead boy, apparently, he hummed, his smirk blossoming into one of the brightest smiles that Tenya had ever witnessed. It almost bled with childlike innocence and charm. He couldn't tell if it was fake or if the boy was just insane. He wasn't sure if he wanted to find out either. Stain didn't appreciate the boy's humor. Faster than Tenya's eyes could fully comprehend, Stain drew a knife from his belt and launched it towards the boy. All he saw was a gleam of metal through the darkness of the alleyway. He didn't even have time to shout a warning before the small blade connected with the boy's shoulder. Or, at least, it should have. Instead, the metal passed through his skin like he was nothing more than mist, an illusion. Tenya wondered if he actually was. It would certainly explain why he was acting like nothing in this world could touch him. The boy sighed as though he had been expecting an entirely different outcome. No, not expecting, hoping was more like it. What that could possibly mean, Tenya didn't want to think about. I'm actually hurt that you weren't listening to the epic, protagonist-esque line that I delivered after you gave some typical villain one-liner. The boy pouted, rubbing despondently at where the blade had passed through him. Really, what's the point of coming up with these fancy, somewhat cool phrases if you're just going to ignore them? Do I need to add more shock value before you finally take them seriously? Do I have to reveal my tragic backstory in some terribly timed monologue? Do I need to stand here and preach my motives, plans, and life story in a dingy alleyway like some stereotypical villain in the movies? Is that what normal people do in these situations? Tell total strangers and people who tried to kill them about their past? Why would I even reveal personal information to my enemies anyway? That actually seems rather counterproductive in the long run if you ask me. Unless, of course, you're stalling for time, then I suppose you do what you gotta do. Shock value and all that, am I right? What the hell are you mumbling about? Stain hissed, charging across the alleyway. His sword raised dangerously. Tenya strained his muscles, preparing for the impact of a battle that the boy seemed to have the upper hand in. It was still horrifying to watch a young boy, barely a teenager, being attacked by lethal blades that had killed many pro-heroes. Tenya was surprised that feeling was beginning to return to his fingers and feet. The boy let out a startled yelp, haphazardly ducking beneath the swing of Stain's sword, the metal barely grazing the top of his hair. Stain swung again, and his sword made a loud clinging noise as it connected with the ground. The sound grated against Tenya's ears, but he couldn't flinch away even if he wanted to. The boy hadn't moved an inch, letting the blade slice through him, yet there wasn't a speck of blood. Was that the boy's quirk? Objects could just phase through him. Was it temporary? Was that why he ducked earlier? Tenya had witnessed him tackling Stain not too long ago. He was solid then. This boy was almost the perfect opponent to fight against Stain, except for the fact that everything he was doing was illegal. Civilians couldn't use their quirks in public without proper licensing. And it would only take an ill-timed swing and one mistake and the boy would get hurt. Or worse. Are all vigilantes horrible listeners? The boy hissed, his voice losing its playful lilt. He rolled away from Stain to put some distance between them, but even then, he was still mindful of Tenya's position. Even Dragon was a better listener than you. Both Tenya and Stain faltered, Stain's blade freezing just inches away from tearing open the boy's throat. If he had followed through with his attack, Tenya would wonder later, would the boy have lost his head? But Dragon, that was the name of a fire-breathing murderer. That meant that this boy had ties with a villain. Stain seemed to reach the same conclusion judging the way his eyes narrowed, almost glowing in the dark. Tenya's fingers twitched, his left arm jolting as pain crawled up his skin. The numbness was beginning to dissipate. He should follow the boy's previous orders and call for help, but could he really trust him now? What could he be planning? The boy with connections to villains. It didn't matter, he decided. He needed help, and he was sure that the boy was going to get himself hurt if he did nothing. Slowly, his hand reached to a hidden pocket at his side for his phone. You're one of those League of Villain brats, Stain stated, his sword remaining inches away from possibly killing the boy. Tenya bit the inside of his cheek to keep himself from reacting as he slipped his hand around his phone. The League of Villains. The same people who attacked his class at the USJ. What was this situation? The boy merely scowled, the light dimming in his emerald green eyes, his nose scrunched in what might have been disgust. But it was too dark to tell. I may be a little messed up, but I wouldn't be caught dead playing with the League, he said, gravel scraping against his tone. Something twisted that Tenya didn't want to name flashed in his eyes just as Tenya pressed a few buttons on his phone. I'm stupid, but not stupid enough to join a villain organization full of bratty people who whine about hero society and attack children. I would assume you're the same, but you did attack a teenager, and you're holding a sword to my neck. So, the boy's eyes darted in his direction, a silent question hovering in his gaze. Tenya nodded, and a smile lit up upon his face. When his eyes drifted back to the vigilante, his head gave a little tilt. It was all the warning Tenya needed. As he shoved himself to his feet, preparing to attack Stain while he was distracted by the boy, Tenya couldn't help but wonder something. If things were different, if something had changed in the boy's life, would he have been a hero? Would he have been walking alongside Tenya at UA? Would they have been classmates? Friends? The answer to this wandering thought was simple. Tenya didn't know, because the boy who could have been a hero, who could have possibly saved 1,000 people, wasn't one. Right now, he was a vigilante saving Tenya's life. That would have to suffice for now. Shadow knew something was wrong when his phone pinged with a notification from Iida. His father was only a few feet ahead of him as he took out his phone, staring at the location that Iida had sent him. The class president was in Hosu, like Shadow, only a few blocks away. Judging by the way the Namu were descending upon the city, Shadow could probably guess that it was no accident. Still, he hesitated for a moment, gazing down at the screen. Something Deku said was itching at his mind. It was 2 days ago, and they were sitting by the lakeside like they used to before the sports festival. Everything seemed normal. Deku was grinning, sitting in the shade of the big tree by the waterside. Shadow had sat beside him. It was a quiet affair, but it was more peaceful than awkward. Their meetings had become shorter and with longer intervals in between because of Shadow's internship starting up. And apparently, Deku had something on his own that was keeping him relatively busy as well. Though, he wouldn't say exactly what it was, just that it was a top-secret mission. Though he sounded playful when he admitted it, Shadow thought that there must have been some truth to that statement. That day, he remembered that he had been thinking about his internship with Endeavor when Deku spoke up, breaking the silence. You're going to be patrolling Hosu this week, right? It seemed so random, but Shadow couldn't blame him. He doubted that even Deku could keep up with the thoughts dancing around in his own head. He nodded. All week, he muttered, trying to keep the bitter edge out of his voice. An entire week, walking alongside his father. Shadow knew that it was his choice to do so, but that didn't make it any less annoying. He was just using Endeavor for his position as the number 2 hero. Nothing more, nothing less. Deku hummed in acknowledgement, but his eyes were shining with silent laughter as though he could read Shadow's mind. It will be over before you know it, he responded, falling back against the grass, sprawling his arms and legs out like a child making a snow angel. Once this is done and over with, you'll have final exams, and then it's summer vacation. You'll probably miss the piece of patrolling for your internship. Shadow had frowned, tilting his head towards his friend. What do you mean? He asked, hoping to catch Deku's gaze, but he was staring stubbornly at the leaves obscuring the clear sky. Deku wore a lazy smile as he shut his eyes, but Shadow could see thin lines of tension running up his body. From what I've seen and heard, Class 1A is a trouble magnet, he stated as though it was the absolute, undisputed truth, which Shadow couldn't say was lie from the short time he spent with his classmates. You never know what's going to happen, especially as you progress through hero training. These may be the last days of peace and quiet for a while. You should enjoy them while they last, even if you hate the company. One of his green eyes peeked open at the last few words left his lips. Deku knew him too well, but then again, it wasn't that hard to figure it out. Shadow offered a small smile in return, flopping down beside the boy. All right, he said simply, content to just lay in the grass with Deku in the little free time he had nowadays. Just as the silence was beginning to regrow, Deku cut it off once again. Hey, Todoroki, he murmured, hesitancy making his words light and airy. Shadow turned his head, the grass tickling his cheek. If something strange happens in Hosu during your patrol, follow your gut feeling, and be careful, he whispered, still wearing the easygoing expression. I don't want to have to visit another someone in the hospital again, he added almost like an afterthought. Shadow's eye had narrowed as he gazed at him. Was that fear? Was Deku afraid for him? Shadow had never been very good at reading emotions, or anything that involved social interaction really, but was he mistaken? It was quite possible. You don't have to worry about me, Deku, he reassured, just in case he was right. If anything bad happens, I will be with Endeavor, and although I don't like him, he is strong. He is the number 2 hero for a reason. Deku had relaxed a fraction, his eyes slipping shut once more. Shadow's words seemed to satisfy his worries, even if he wasn't entirely sure why the boy was worried in the first place. They spent the rest of their time together in peaceful silence. Follow your gut feeling, and be careful. Those words were on a constant repeat now in Shadow's head. His instincts were screaming at him to go find Iida immediately. Even if he had barely spoken to his classmates since the beginning of the year, he knew something was wrong. My classmate's in trouble, he stated as a way of explanation as he pocketed his phone, sprinting in the opposite direction Endeavor was heading. His father shouted someone in response. But Shadow wasn't paying any attention to the man. He was completely focused on finding the location that had been sent to his phone. When he was near, he heard the familiar scuffles of a fight ensuing. Shadow slowed once he reached the mouth of the alley, the sight before him stealing his breath. Iida was trading blows with a strange man wearing a scarlet scarf and a dirty white cloth that encircled his piercing eyes. Through the darkness, Shadow caught the glimmer of the swords in the man's hands as well as a few more at his waist and thighs. If he squinted, he could have sworn that one of his blades was already speckled with blood. There was more blood glinting in the dim lighting on Iida's arm. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. That wasn't what made his throat clench shut. It was the fact that Deku was there as well, fighting the vigilante alongside his classmate, his head dripping crimson. Deku was hurt. Deku was looking right at him. His green eyes widened. Iida, Deku warned. Iida fell back away from the man just as Shadow stomped on the ground, rising a pillar of pure ice where he once stood. Deku followed his classmate's lead until they were all three standing side by side. The man easily dodged, falling deeper in the alley. Do you mind explaining why you're fighting a sword-wielding maniac, Deku? He could tell his voice was too harsh when he saw the small boy flinch out of the corner of his eye. Though, Shadow had other things to worry about at the moment than if he was acting a little cruel, especially when he noticed that there was more blood coating Deku's forearms, and the man with the blades was hissing furiously. You know this boy? Iida inquired, a certain tightness in his voice that Shadow had never heard before. Deku wiped some blood from his forehead before it could stream into his eye. Let's save the introductions for when Stain is apprehended, he snapped, annoyance leaking into his tone. It would seem that he didn't care if his words were delicate either. Not when he had spent God knows how long fighting a vigilante known as the hero killer with Deku. The man, Stain, mused, his teeth glinting dangerously, hungrily. It's quite interesting that you have ties within both the hero and villain worlds. I think I'll remember you, kid. Deku grimaced in disgust. Please tell me you told someone where you were going and pro-heroes are currently on the way. He murmured only so Shadow and Iida would hear him. The pros are a little caught up fighting the Namu and evacuating the city, Shadow stated, narrowing his eyes at the vigilante. Endeavor will probably come looking for me once he's finished, so we'll just have to hold him off until help arrives, Iida muttered. Shadow nodded. You should get out of here. Deku, you're bleeding and you seem to have taken a hit to the head. It's dangerous for you here. Deku scowled, his brow pinched. I think he's a bit too interested to let me leave that easily. He growled, but his glare was directed at Shadow himself. Not that I would either way. I can handle myself. You should just worry about not getting cut by his blades. If he ingests your blood, you'll be paralyzed. Stain finally made a move, his blades twirling as he rebounded off the walls, preparing for the kill. Shadow threw up another pillar of ice as Iida and Deku scattered to avoid the attack. The man cut through the ice with his blades, dodging the shattered particles with practiced ease. Shadow sent a wave of flames with a swipe of his left arm, searing the end of Stain's scarf. The man cackled as he landed back on the ground, a small dagger leaving his hand as he threw it towards Shadow. A sharp pain cut across his left cheek as the blade grazed the skin just beneath his scar. The dagger made a quiet thud behind him as it buried itself in the ground. Iida shouted something incomprehensible as his kick landed a hit on Stain's side. He couldn't make out the words, but Deku's expression darkened as he ducked beneath one of the vigilante's blades. If he wasn't fighting for his life, their lives, he would have acknowledged that this was the first time that he's ever seen Deku angry. That this was the first time that Shadow got to see the darkness he knew was lingering beneath the smiles and laughter since day one. But that would sink in later. Shadow was almost, dare he say it, impressed when Deku punched Stain in the face as he was recovering from Iida's kick. He would have admitted it to himself had Deku not been a civilian fighting a dangerous vigilante that had killed pro-heroes. Shadow didn't know if Deku had any training whatsoever, but that didn't matter much. It was still too dangerous for him here. If only he wasn't so stubborn, he would understand that his life was at risk. Shadow didn't want him to get hurt. Or worse. Deku stumbled backward as one of Stain's blades swung a little too close to his throat. You were so talkative before, Deku, Stain exclaimed, a dark joy littering his voice. What happened? Are you worried about your precious friends? Shadow didn't like the way he said Deku's name. It made his skin crawl. Deku didn't seem to like it either. I am rather curious about something. Deku mused instead of answering. A little calmer than Shadow thought was appropriate considering the fact that Stain was making a grab for him. His hand simply passed through his body as Deku retreated. Shadow sent icicles to ward off Stain until Deku got to a safe enough distance. Not that anywhere here was particularly safe. You see, I don't really believe in coincidences, so I'm just a little confused as to why the League of Villains just so happened to attack the same city that you've been holing up in. Stain bared his teeth as Iida attacked from behind. Shadow froze the ground beneath his feet, but he jumped away, using the walls as leverage. An alliance, perhaps, Deku continued, letting another one of Stain's seemingly endless supply of blades pass through him. Doubtful considering how Shigaraki openly wants to kill All Might while you adore the man. Did you piss off Shigaraki by chance? Is this all just a temper tantrum of his? How am I supposed to know what that man-child is thinking? Shadow wished that Deku would stop provoking him. It's almost like he wanted Stain to come after. Deku wanted Stain to come after him. Shadow swore that if, when they got out of there, Deku would get a stern talking to about self-preservation, battle strategies, and why he should not aggravate enemies. I'm sorry, I thought you wanted me to talk more. Deku giggled, despite Shadow's obvious glare on him. I guess I was wrong. Before Shadow could comprehend what was happening, Stain was already rushing towards him. Deku and Iida called out a warning, but Shadow was already raising a column of ice to try and push him back. Stain easily overcame that obstacle, launching past Shadow entirely. Why would he? Todoroki. The knife. He wasn't sure whether it was Deku or Iida that time around, but he was already whirling to stop the vigilante. His body went numb. He saw another blade sailing through the air, directly for him. He suddenly felt a bitterly cold hand shoving at his shoulder. His eyes widened. He never heard the blade make connect with his flesh, but it was buried to the hilt in Deku's stomach. Shadow was still falling when shock washed over Deku's expression. He hit the ground. Deku didn't. He just stared at the blade protruding from his body with confusion. There still wasn't any blood. Shadow couldn't help but note. Izuku, he whispered so softly, too softly in the deafening silence. Everything was frozen, even the vigilante, even Deku. Deku was too still. Deku wasn't moving. Deku wasn't breathing. Why wasn't Deku moving? Deku blinked, his hand moving to the handle. Don't, Shadow screamed, forced to watch as his friend ripped the weapon from his own stomach. There was no blood on the blade. The sound was too loud in the alleyway as the dagger clattered on the concrete. You really are a horrible listener. Izuku was regretting not telling Todoroki the fact that he was already dead when he saw the boy's expression. It hadn't even taken a thought to push him out of the way. But Izuku hadn't expected to feel a small stab of pain. He hadn't expected Todoroki's expression to be a perfect reflection of his mother's during those early days oh so long ago. His heterochromatic eyes were wide with horror, taking on an almost glassy appearance in the darkness of the alley. His face was slackened with shock, and Izuku was sure that if his body hadn't been paralyzed, he would have been trembling. Izuku tried his best to ignore the memories resurfacing, but they kept prodding at his brain, so he simply avoided Todoroki's eyes. It stung a little, the blade. It stung worse when he pulled it out, but it wasn't painful. Nothing more than a little prick. He didn't want to wonder what that meant. He hadn't felt pain in months. Nothing physical anyway. Sure, recently his scars had been burning, but that wasn't pain. Irritation, perhaps. But it didn't hurt, it was just a strange annoyance. This was a familiar sting that he hadn't experienced since he fell. Though it was familiar, it scared him. He wasn't supposed to feel the knife digging into his skin, but he did. It all went away when the knife clattered to the ground. The pain was emotional when he heard Todoroki whisper his name, his real name. "That's an interesting quirk you have there," Stain murmured, his eyes flashing with something Izuku couldn't identify. Izuku wondered how he was going to explain this once they got out of this situation. Todoroki would surely yell at him for being so reckless, and if Iida was still around, he'd probably join in. He would listen because he deserved it, and he'd give half-hearted answers to questions that Todoroki shouldn't be asking. He'd focus more on that issue once they were safe. Mission. Think of the mission. Izuku wiped the blood from his forehead, gazing disinterestedly down at the scarlet liquid. He didn't know how he was going to explain that either, especially when he calmed down enough for the blood and wounds to disappear. "One step at a time, I suppose," he said in reply, stepping protectively in front of Todoroki's prone body. He was rather curious about a few things, including why it hurt to be stabbed when he was a ghost, but those had to wait. Iida appeared at his side, his face paler than before and looking a little out of it. It seemed like he wanted to say something but held the words back. "We need a plan," he stated, his voice harsh, determined. "We should continue on as though the pros aren't coming." Izuku nodded, his eyes never leaving Stain. "Our best bet is to tire him out until Todoroki can freeze him in ice," he explained quietly. "My quirk isn't combat efficient, but I can be a good distraction. Iida can get in a few blows while he's focused on attacking me. And Todoroki, as soon as you recover and see an opportunity, use it." Iida nodded once while Todoroki made a noise as to protest but seemed to let the issue go. "I don't like the idea of putting you in danger, but it's probably the best plan we have," Iida muttered, preparing a battle stance. "Shall we?" Izuku asked, but it was more like a statement. Iida's reply was blasting forward, the engines in his calves exploding with light. Izuku stole one more glance down at Todoroki before following. He didn't want to dissect the look in his friend's eyes. Not now. So he rushed towards danger in the form of a vigilante wielding swords and a paralysis quirk. Stain was much warier now, considering how all his attacks seemed to do nothing against Izuku. The man quickly changed his target to Iida, but Izuku was determined to make it nearly impossible to get a hit in on the boy. He did everything he could with the mindset he had. It was difficult to focus on solidifying himself enough to grab Stain's wrist to force his blades away when his thoughts were a jumbled mess of what if. Concentration wasn't usually an issue for Izuku, but now he had 2 lives on the line. Maybe that's why his blood continued to flow from his head, from his forearms. There were more than a few times when he feared his hand would slip through Stain. Stain was fast, more agile than the police and news gave the vigilante credit for. Izuku supposed that it was experience with dealing with a multitude of heroes. He wouldn't have been surprised if the man had some sort of training before this either. That and he had a quirk that was practically meant for battling any sort of opponent. And he certainly wasn't afraid to utilize it. Iida maneuvered around Stain's guard to try and land a hit while Izuku played his part as the distraction. Izuku had no fighting experience whatsoever. He wasn't like Iida in that respect. The best he could do was block Stain's view or divert his attacks before they could hit. Stain made a hissing noise from the back of his throat, jumping away, Iida's leg only grazing his side. It wasn't enough to throw him off balance, but it did make him take a moment to recover. A moment that Izuku and Iida were both ready to take advantage of. Iida burst forward, pursuing the vigilante's retreat. Izuku almost winced in sympathy as Iida's leg connected with the man's back, forcing him to stumble, and Izuku grabbed at his hair when he was falling, swiftly connecting at his face with his knee. There was a satisfying crunching noise as Stain's teeth cracked, but that satisfaction turned into panic when the vigilante didn't fall but, rather, grabbed Izuku's ankle. He didn't even seem to flinch as blood dripped down his face. Izuku tried to pull away, to slip through Stain's grasp, but nothing happened. He was trapped in the vigilante's hold, and his body wasn't responding to him. He threw Izuku into the wall like it was nothing. He slammed through the brick into the actual building itself. He rolled to a stop a few feet from where he had entered from, and he swore that if his heart was still beating, it would have been pounding in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, almost slipping a few times before he straightened fully. If he got nothing out of this fight, at least he knew now that he didn't appreciate being thrown around like a ragdoll. But that moment, that single moment, where Izuku couldn't phase through Stain, it haunted him. He knew he wasn't untouchable, but he was always able to control who was able to touch him. It took focus. It took concentration. Yet, he wasn't able to drop it, and Stain had managed to grab him. Even when he begged his body fade away into the background, he didn't like that his body hadn't listened to his commands. It filled him to the brim with dread and fear. First, it was the pain from the knife, and now he had failed to escape someone's grip. He didn't like where this was leading. He didn't like the path he was heading down. What if this was the first step to his disappearance? What if he was soon going to fade away? The loss of control, the emotions simply vanishing, the burning itch of his scars. He shook off the thoughts before the panic could properly settle in. Iida and Todoroki were still out there, still fighting. Izuku jumped back through the same wall in which Stain had tossed him through, only to see Todoroki freezing the man up to his shoulders and eyes. Izuku wasn't sure if the vigilante was unconscious or simply out of it, but he was finally incapacitated. Iida and Todoroki were huffing relieved, tired breaths, and he could see the exhaustion weighing down on them heavily. Slowly, Todoroki's eyes drifted from the vigilante to Izuku, something dark flashing within them. "Deku," he began, his voice low and dangerous as if he was about to scold him. It would definitely be well-deserved, but Todoroki didn't know the full story. Izuku scratched the back of his head, letting out a nervous chuckle. "Todoroki, you're not paralyzed anymore." He cheered with far too much joy in his tone to be believable. "Does that mean the paralysis isn't on a timer? You snapped out of it a whole lot quicker than Iida did. Is it the amount of blood consumed that determines the time paralyzed? Maybe blood type?" "Todoroki, the pros are on their way," Iida chimed in, effectively cutting Izuku off mid-rant. The light from his phone, which Izuku had no idea when he pulled it out, illuminated his face, sending sparks of light along his glasses. "It would seem they've dealt with the Namu already." Izuku's brow furrowed, his lips tightening into a frown. He took a few cautious steps until he was in front of the vigilante, who, in fact, wasn't quite unconscious. "You know, you never did tell me why the League of Villains are attacking Hosu," he mused, offering up a bright grin that was so fake it almost hurt. "I know Tamura Shigaraki is a little unstable, but he must have a reason, no matter how twisted it is. Did he offer you a proposal? And when you didn't accept, he decided to try and overshadow you as revenge? Is this all really one big temper tantrum?" Stain huffed a breathless laugh. Blood smeared across his face. "Are you sure you don't have any ties to the League?" He spat, venom dripping from his words like the blood off his chin. "You already seem to know the answer, so why bother asking the questions in the first place, kid?" Izuku raised a brow curiously. "I don't have any ties to the League, which is why I'm asking you," he stated, lightly, like he was explaining it to a small child that didn't know any better. "But if you know nothing about what's happening, I suppose there's no reason to continue this conversation." Stain chuckled darkly, his eyes suddenly wide with wild mania. Izuku couldn't help how he unconsciously took a step back at the abrupt change in demeanor. "Now, you know what? You're starting to remind me of someone," he exclaimed, sickening humor leaking in his voice like oil spilling into water. "The obsession with quirks, the calculating look on your face, the way you lose interest in things once you've figured them all out." There was a pause that was only filled with the vigilante's ear-splitting laughter and shocked silence. "You're so much like Dragon it makes me sick." Izuku felt the smile freeze on his face, his vision flashing red. Not with blood, not this time. Rage so blinding and hot burst through his chest. But he didn't dare move a muscle. He didn't dare lash out, beat the man until he was just as red as his vision. He didn't want to prove him right. He was nothing like his father. "That's enough. Even your expression is the same as his," Stain spat, cutting off Todoroki with venom alone. The vigilante's expression contorted into one of obvious disgust and such gut-wrenching hatred that it curled in Izuku's stomach. "I bet you fool everyone with that stupid smile, spewing your pretty words. Did you learn that from Villain himself?" Izuku, my. Does that usually work on people?" Izuku questioned, finally letting his smile fall into the void, wiped clean from his face. The rage was still burning in his chest, still picking away at his will not to do something rash, but Izuku was allowing it to simmer. He was never one to let anger blind him. Instead, he cocked his head, allowing his hair to hide the blood dripping into his eye. "I'm not an expert in psychology, much less concerning murderers or heroes, but does that method usually work to provoke your victims into lashing out? Do you expect a specific sort of reaction out of me? Or are you just testing to see how much I really am like Dragon?" Stain's lips turned up into a bloody smile. "There it is," he whispered. "Like father, like son after all." He said it so quietly that Izuku didn't know if Iida and Todoroki had heard it. Even he, who was standing only a handful of inches away, had to strain to pick out the words. Izuku parted his lips to say something else when he was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Deku, I think it's best to leave the interrogation to the police," Iida interjected tightly. Izuku recognized the shadow beneath his navy eyes. He'd been seeing it for the last few days. "Is that why you're so curious about the League of Villains?" Stain demanded, as though Iida hadn't spoken at all. His eyes were little more than tiny slits in the darkness. "What, do you want to follow in Dragon's footsteps or something?" Todoroki hissed something, his left side igniting in rage, protectiveness. Izuku wasn't quite sure, but it left his chest feeling the slightest bit lighter than it had been moments before. The anger dissipating the smallest fraction, replaced with a glimmer of something else. Despite the fact that Todoroki might kill him again later for being a reckless idiot, he was still defending him. Izuku, however, did not share the defensive rage blooming in Todoroki's eyes. They were both angry, but for entirely different reasons. Izuku had to wonder if he should feel something about the man insinuating that Izuku wanted to be a villain, a killer. But he didn't. That little thought didn't matter to him. Being compared to his father, on the other hand, was more important to him. He didn't know if it was because he honestly didn't find the statement offensive, or if he was so numb to such things that it didn't matter to him. That was another question that shouldn't be answered. Tragic backstories are a level 4 friendship achievement. And unfortunately for you, you will never reach that level, Izuku chirped, the bright smile returning full blast to his face. It was such a 180 that the vigilante almost seemed speechless, if only for a moment. He clasped his hands behind his back as he rocked back on his heels. He turned back to face Todoroki, the smile drooping into something real. Sirens were beginning to echo through the air. I should probably leave before the police and heroes get here, so I suppose I'll see you later. Izuku mock saluted and spun on his heel to leave, but found his way blocked by Iida. It is unwise to leave a crime scene before the police can get a statement, he said stiffly, clutching his injured arm to his stomach. He's right, Deku, Todoroki added in, worry seeping into his voice, but Izuku could still detect traces of that unfamiliar protectiveness lingering there. Besides, you're hurt. You should get checked out by a hospital. He made it sound less like a suggestion and more like an order, but unfortunately, Izuku was skilled in the art of deflecting worry. He just hoped that Todoroki and Iida were as gullible as the other adults in Izuku's life. It's just a few scrapes, nothing to worry about. They'll be gone before you know it, he assured. And as much as it may have sounded like one, it wasn't a lie. Once he was calm, the blood would disappear as though it never existed in the first place. Also, if the police found me in Hosu when I have a very strict alibi that places me elsewhere, things might get a little complicated. Iida's brow furrowed. Are you sure you aren't a secret villain, Deku? He inquired, his hand clenching a little tighter around his arm. Izuku chuckled nervously, withholding the urge to snap at Aizawa's student. That's an interesting theory, he said, shoving his hands in the pockets of his shorts. Incorrect but interesting. I'm just on a secret mission for a secret client that shall remain unnamed for privacy and legal purposes. Now, I best go to that client and tell them the good news. Without another word, Izuku slipped back through the building's wall for the third time that night, followed only by Todoroki and Iida's quiet shouts. Though time would never change for him, Izuku already knew this was going to be a long night. Shoto would never consider himself a violent person. He knew he wasn't exactly a peacemaker either, but he was well known for being placid, except for the times when Deku decided to become a self-sacrificing idiot. It was only then that Shoto imagined himself smacking some sense into his friend's head because God knows he needed it after this whole fiasco. No one with common sense would talk back to a vigilante who had a body count larger than some villains. No one with common sense would taunt or interrogate such a person either, but Deku had. The next time he saw Deku, Shoto was going to push him into the lake. But despite the pressure boiling in his chest, he knew that he had been more worried about his friend rather than frustrated. Though, there was plenty of frustration as well. What sort of person didn't seem to be bothered by the fact that they could possibly die if they made the wrong move? Apparently, Deku who, as far as Shoto was aware, had no special combat training of any sort whatsoever. Deku who was bloodied and wounded but didn't seem to notice. Deku who had worn such an unfamiliar air around him that Shoto wondered if he was another person entirely. Deku who had simply stood there with a grin as he was compared to his father, a murderer, a villain, a monster. Shoto knew that Deku was calculating, intelligent beyond what he himself would believe. He knew that Deku analyzed everything, even the smallest of situations, and whether that was from his hobby of watching heroes or if it was ingrained into him, Shoto didn't want to know. What Shoto didn't know that Deku could be so cold, yet make his words seem kind, lighthearted. It scared him, the way that his friend spoke to Stain like he was just another person on the street, gently goading information out of him with a grin that was as fake as the kindness he wore. He hadn't known the boy for very long, just a few months at the most, but he believed that he knew Deku. Now he was just left with more questions that shouldn't be answered because Shoto knew that he wouldn't like what he found. Why was Deku in Hosu? Why did he warn Shoto to follow his instincts when he was patrolling days before? Did he know something was going to happen? Was this what his secret mission was? Hunt down Stain. Stain had called Deku by his real name, even began to say his surname before he was interrupted. How did Stain know that? Was it because he knew Dragon? How was he fine after getting stabbed? Why did he save me? There were so many questions that were swirling around his head as he sat in the silent hospital room, he didn't know what to do with them. Iida rested on the bed across from his arm in a sling, and his expression twisted in thought. How do you know that boy? Iida questioned quietly in the silence that permeated between them. They both had just been interrogated by the police maybe an hour ago, and they both had forgotten to mention any both named Deku. They were thoroughly scolded and had been informed that Endeavor would take credit for taking down Stain, so neither one of them would be charged with vigilantism. It had been annoying, to say the least. Shadow poked at the bandage covering his cheek, just below the scar where he had been cut. He's my friend, he stated simply, blandly. Iida shifted on his bed. He seems to have some questionable connections, especially with the villain dragon. Shadow gazed down at the pale sheets crinkling beneath his weight rather than at the class president. From what Deku had told him in the past, he could easily guess what their relationship was. But Iida didn't know what he did. He didn't know that Deku's father was a villain. According to Present Mike, he's Aizawa Sensei's ward. He hadn't heard it directly from Deku, but Present Mike was supposedly Aizawa's best friend, so he would be aware of things no student would. And Present Mike seemed to recognize Deku when Shadow had described him at the sports festival. If I were you, I wouldn't get too attached to him. You never know when he might disappear for good. Those words still haunted Shadow, the implications that Deku might one day leave, vanish, without so much as a word of warning. Present Mike had never appeared so serious. Iida's head shot up in shock, his lips parted slightly. Is that true, Todoroki? He murmured, a bit breathless with confusion. I was not aware that Aizawa was looking after a kid. It's because I'm not. Both their heads snapped towards the open doorway where their teacher stood in all black and an exhaustive expression. His dark eyes were harsh, accented by the scar slicing across his cheek, just beneath his eye. And his hair was the same, long mess it usually was. Aizawa-sensei, you two are very fortunate that you received this deal, otherwise you may have been expelled from UA. The man stated, shutting the door behind him with a small click that echoed too loudly in the room. And you are also very fortunate that Izuku was around when he was, or else you might not have made it to the hospital. Do you understand? There was a small chorus of yes, sensei from both of them. Aizawa sighed, stepping further into the room, the rough edges of his face seeming to soften. Now that that's out of the way, I'm going to encourage you not to mention anything about Izuku to anyone outside this room, he continued on, shoving his hands in his pockets. There is a reason why he is staying with me, and the fewer people that know of his existence, the better. Shadow's blood froze in his veins. What do you mean by that, sensei? The words left Shadow's lips faster than he could rein them back in, but Aizawa didn't seem to mind too much. But Aizawa did seem a bit hesitant to answer, which meant that it was serious. None of this leaves this room, got it? He hissed. His eyes narrowed as his gaze switched from Iida's to Shadow's. They both nodded, the tension rising to a suffocating level. There is reason to believe that the League of Villains is interested in our little problem child, he explained gravely, and Shadow didn't miss the way his hands tightened into fists in his pockets. Shadow's own hands dug into his thighs where they rested in his lap. What exactly their objective is with him is unclear, and that is why he is staying with me. Shadow had to look away to hide his expression from the others. 1,000 memories of Deku grinning and talking about nothing and everything at the same time infiltrated his mind. The carefree moments, the ones full of laughter and jokes and little banter back and forth. He was being chased by a villain organization that had managed to break into UA. And all this time, he still went to the lake with Shadow and smiled like nothing was wrong. It made sense now that Shadow could conclude that Dragon was probably his father, and Dragon was working with the League of Villains. Is that why Deku kept asking Stain about the League? Iida asked, whispered, breaking through the growing tension. Shadow felt more than saw Aizawa's confusion. He was asking for info. Iida nodded sharply. He believed that the League had offered Stain a deal of some sort but that he rejected it, and their leader attacked Hosu as revenge. He just asked questions to confirm his theories. Aizawa scowled, his stare slipping to the floor in thought. Shadow watched the gears turning in his teacher's head, unable to follow their process but seeing them work all the same. Did he say anything else? He demanded, still not looking up at them. Stain and Deku did mention Shigaraki Tamura once, but Dragon was their main topic, Shadow added in, his voice flat even in his own ears. There was something about a secret mission for a client as an excuse to leave before the police arrived as well. Aizawa huffed a breath that may have been a laugh or just an annoyed sigh. Of course the problem child did, he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. His shoulders seemed to slump with the weight of his tiredness. With another sigh, he lifted his head back up to stare at his students. I hope you have learned your lesson from this experience. I'll be leaving now so the nurses can check up on your injuries. With that, their teacher turned around, heading back towards the door. Shadow scrambled to his feet, a sudden wave of panic filling him. Wait, Aizawa-sensei, he nearly yelled, surprising himself as well as the others in the room. Deku was injured when he left. Is he all right? Aizawa glanced over his shoulder with a furrowed brow which could only be read as bewilderment. Oh, yes, he had a few cuts after the fight. Iida chimed in, tapping his chin with his uninjured hand. Did he get those treated yet? For the first time since Shoto had known Aizawa, his eyes widened with something like realization. The emotion was quickly buried, but it was too late. Shoto had seen it. Their teacher turned his head back around, opening the door before answering. He's fine now. Good as new. Shoto would never consider himself to be an optimist. He let his Ashi have all those happy thoughts. He wasn't stupid enough to hope that everything would turn out fine in the end. He learned not to during many missions as an underground hero at the USJ. It took more than petty optimism and hope to succeed. It required action. But he certainly wasn't a pessimist either, no matter how many times everything seemed to go wrong in his life. No matter how many failures stacked up against him. No matter how many friends he lost along the way, how many people have died when he could have saved them, he still believed there was a reason to hope. He simply didn't let that hope blind reality. Shoto was a realist. He saw the straight facts of the situation and went from there. For years, Shoto had prided himself on creating strategies to take down enemies and diffusing situations by looking at the facts. He never got distracted by optimistic thoughts or was let down when things seemed to spiral. He simply adjusted to the changes. That's what he thought at least, but he's never been in these circumstances before. Now he found himself desperately wishing things would turn out for the better. He stood in Naomasa Tsukachi's office at the police station, a dozen or so files piled in front of the pro-hero and detective. Shoto had been working with Naomasa since the sports festival, since Midoriya's body disappeared from the cemetery. But so far, their investigations had been less fruitful than what Shoto had hoped they'd be. They had discovered who had Midoriya's body but not the why or where. When Shoto had received an urgent call from the detective stating that new information had appeared 15 minutes ago, he had tried his best to squash the pressure building up in his chest. He didn't know what Naomasa's men had found. He was just given an order to come to the police station as soon as possible in a grim voice that Shoto was growing too accustomed to. He had asked Midoriya if he wanted to come along with him to hear the news for himself as he was preparing to leave. The boy just scratched the back of his neck, a small, guilty smile on his lips, and said that he was mentally drained after everything with Stain. He said he'd sit this one out and that Shoto could fill him in later. He was a little hesitant, but eventually, Shoto left the kid alone to head to the station. Now he was almost regretting not working harder to convince the boy to come. What are all these? Shoto murmured, flipping through the last manila folder with another set of gruesome pictures depicting half-rotting corpses with twisted, mutilated bodies. Blood splashed across the frame, pooling around their bodies that seemed to have writhed in agony moments before their death. Shoto didn't want to imagine what they had been forced to go through before they died, but the thoughts made his stomach churn. Tsukachi pursed his lips, his brow furrowing, as it had been far too much recently. Those are 8 bodies that have appeared all around Japan since Izuku Midoriya's body was taken. He stated, sounding just as exhausted as Shoto felt. They were originally missing persons. Shoto shut the file, dropping it next to the 7 similar ones on Tsukachi's desk. What happened to them? The detective sighed, sitting up a little straighter in his office chair. That would be why I called you here on such short notice, he said, running his hands over his face. One of the Namu from Hosu was apprehended, as you are probably aware. Tsukachi waited for Shoto to nod in confirmation before continuing his explanation. Our men were put on a rush order to find out anything we could about it. And the results of the analysis came in not too long ago. Shoto sucked in a breath. What did you find? He asked, already feeling as though he would regret the answer he'd receive. Human DNA. He blinked slowly. What? Tsukachi nodded as if he felt Shoto's confusion on a personal level. The tests came back and revealed that the Namu had human DNA. If not slightly altered, he explained, his eyes darkening. Which means that the Namu are human, or were at some point in time. Besides the multiple quirks, it would seem there were many changes made to their DNA. Shoto shook his head, his black hair falling forward, only to be pushed back a moment later. Memories of the USJ swirled around his mind. The Namu's beady eyes as it stared blankly down at him before smashing him into the concrete mercilessly. Its bulging, pulsating muscles as it stood like an obedient dog awaiting orders. That Namu was comprised of animalistic instinct, bloodlust, and an ability to act on its own desires. There was nothing human about it. Not anymore. Are you telling me that Namu are actually human experiments conducted by the League of Villains? Shoto demanded, his eyes narrowing as the detective merely sighed once more. Or at least someone connected to the League. Shoto grabbed one of the files once more, staring at the photos with a newfound horror. And these? What do these have to do with the League or the Namu? There was a pause full of tension. It would appear that that is what happens when the experimentation fails. Shoto's eyes skimmed over the photos once more. The broken, gnarled limbs that twisted around their bodies in ugly, unnatural ways. It was almost as though they had grown and contorted into something less than human. Their faces were barely recognizable compared to how they once were. They were elongated into snouts, much like the beak that the Namu at the USJ possessed. and their muscles were bulging knots that split their flesh open, revealing the bone beneath. It was worse than sickening. Something clicked in Shouda's mind, his head shooting up to meet Tsukachi's resigned gaze. You think they're experimenting on Midoriya's body? It wasn't a question. There was no hesitance or wondering in his voice. It was merely stating the facts. Tsukachi nodded. Dragon is known for his hatred of quirkless people, and Midoriya was quirkless, he said, his voice tight. So it's either experimentation for the League of Villains, or Dragon vandalized his son's grave because he genuinely hated him for not having a quirk. But with Dragon's ties to the League, the former makes the most sense. Of course, these are merely speculations and assumptions. There's no real, definitive proof to prove that Midoriya's body is being used as an experiment. White-hot rage boiled in Shouda's chest. But why would they take the corpse of a kid who's been dead for almost a year, especially one whose body was not built to hold a quirk, much less multiple? We don't know what the process of mummification is, or if Midoriya's body was stolen for that purpose for sure, Tsukachi stated, mindlessly stacking up the files, layering them into a neat pile. That's the problem, unfortunately. We don't have all the information required to make any final conclusions. All we can say is that it is a possibility that we may find Izuku Midoriya's body like all the others. He hated how easy it was to imagine it after seeing the photos. The tufts of forest green hair that may have seemed black in the darkness, crusted with blood, contorted limbs and broken, sliced skin. Shouda shook off the ugly thought before it consumed him. What's our next move then? Tsukachi scratched his head. That's the difficult part, I'm afraid. Continuing on with this investigation would require us to hunt down the League of Villains and Dragon, which is proving to be especially hard. It doesn't help that they have a warp gate user on their side. So what you're saying is that there's nothing we can do but wait. Unfortunately, Shouda sighed, running a frustrated hand through his hair. He wasn't an optimist. He wasn't going to just believe that the League of Villains were simply going to fall into their hands, and they'd be able to recover Midoriya's body in the same state it was stolen in. That would be too simple, too easy. Shouda knew that that's never how villains worked. He was a realist. He knew that by the time they found the League of Villains or Dragon, Midoriya's body would probably be another failed experiment under their belt, disfigured and broken, and Shouda didn't want to see the expression the boy would wear when he saw what they'd done. Not after witnessing what Midoriya looked like when he'd seen his empty coffin and horrified mother. Shouda didn't want to see the boy's expression when he told him of the things he'd learned today. How was he supposed to explain this to Midoriya? How was he supposed to tell a child something like this? Izuku cocked his head, leaning against the wall right beside the firmly shut door. He hadn't bothered reading the black and gold lettering on the small nameplate labeling it. He already knew who was inside. He had watched them enter only a handful of minutes before. Their voices weren't loud. Unsurprisingly, he knew that topics such as these were ones that were best spoken in quiet. Harsh voices mingled with tiredness and worry. Who knew what sort of unsavories could be listening in after all? He was all too familiar with overhearing adults' grim conversations. He knew the soft murmurs so well they built a storm of dread in his stomach. It reminded him far too much of the times he stood outside his father's office while the man was taking business calls. He had to strain to hear their words. But at least the rest of the building was quiet. He wondered if that was a rare occurrence. Soon enough, even their soft murmurs had died off in the room. Died, huh? Izuku tapped his chin thoughtfully, a small, painful smile stretching across his lips. Anamu, eh? He hummed, pushing himself from the wall. No eyes followed his movements. No one could see the poor, little ghost. No one knew he was here. Not even the one person in the building who had the ability to see him. He made his way towards the exit silently, a small bounce in his step and his freshly re-scarred hands clasped behind his back. Interesting, very interesting. Izuku once prided himself on being an optimist. Even when he was told he was quirkless, he had been determined to find a way to become a hero. Heroes didn't need to have a quirk. He could be just like All Might. Even when Kaken started calling him Deku. Even when his mother clung to him, tears spilling from her eyes as she apologized over and over and over again. If Izuku just kept smiling, he could be a hero. He had genuinely believed that. He believed that if he didn't give up, everything would work itself out in the end. He couldn't be a hero now. And his optimism was little more than burning embers. That's why he stole Miss Fluffernugget on his way to go see Todoroki at the lake. Izuku knew that he was going to be lectured and that Todoroki was angry. He had worried his friend far too much these last few weeks. He deserved to be yelled at, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to try and bribe him with a cat to get a lighter sentence. Izuku knew the game and played it well. Todoroki liked cats, especially Miss Fluffernugget, and Izuku didn't want to be punished for his somewhat troubling behavior. It was simple logic, really. There was very little optimism in his thought process, and he couldn't help but wonder when he had lost it. Izuku could guess, but that would lead him down a dark path of thinking, and he didn't want to do that. So he waited by the lakeside, Miss Fluffernugget in his lap until Todoroki arrived. What finally alerted him of his friend's appearance was the snapping of sticks and the soft rustling of clothes as he approached. Izuku immediately turned his head, Miss Fluffernugget resting at his side, her chin laying on his thigh. He was met with narrowed heterochromatic eyes and pursed lips. Izuku stumbled to his feet, cat in arms. Deku, wait. Izuku nearly screamed, effectively freezing Todoroki in his place just a few feet ahead of him. Before you say anything, I offer you a cat. Izuku held out Miss Fluffernugget, who meowed irritably as her nap was interrupted. Todoroki blinked, gazing down at the cat like it was some foreign object before recognition flashed in his eyes. Then his expression became disbelieving. It was almost a comical sight to witness from someone who was usually so stoic. I thought you said Miss Fluffernugget wasn't your cat, he murmured, gently taking the tabby from Izuku's hands, cradling it against his chest like it was his most precious treasure. She purred in content, nuzzling her small head into the left side of his neck. Izuku grinned when he noticed some of the hardness dissipating from his friend's eyes. I made friends with her owner, he explained, which was a general oversimplification, but not entirely untrue. He wasn't quite sure how to describe his relationship with Aizawa yet, so for now, he wouldn't. Just because you're bribing me with a cat doesn't mean you're getting out of this conversation, Deku. The razor edge to his voice was gone, but Izuku wasn't stupid enough to believe that Todoroki wasn't just as pissed as before. It may have been difficult for an outsider to see, for someone who didn't know him well, but Izuku saw the tightness gathered around his hunched shoulders. He saw the dullness that dampened the usual spark in his dual-colored eyes. While his expression may have been blank, Izuku knew the boy was almost seething beneath his perfect picture of calm. He had all the right to be. I'm perfectly fine, he reassured him, spreading his arms out to show that there were no longer any visible injuries. His scars had resealed, the blood disappearing completely once he returned back to Aizawa's apartment. Izuku lifted up the hem of his shirt, revealing where Stain's blade had pierced him, and pretended not to inwardly squeak when Todoroki's stare roamed his body. I'm not hurt in any way, shape, or form. That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Todoroki's eyes flared with fire, vicious, angry, but not at him. No, never at him. Izuku was glad that Todoroki's hands were full with Miss Fluffernugget at the moment, even though he knew that Todoroki would never actually lay a hand on him. Years of abuse and torment still formed an ugly pit of apprehension in his stomach. Not hurt, he repeated, his words as cold as ice, snapping Izuku out of whatever nightmare was growing in his mind. You were covered in blood when I got there. You were bleeding and fighting a vigilante who has killed pro-heroes with my classmate. You were accused of being a villain, and Stain openly compared you to your abusive father. I saw the way you reacted, so don't you dare try and tell me you weren't hurt. Izuku dropped the hem of his shirt, staring at his friend with a dropped jaw. Incredulousness parted his lips, and Izuku was so sure that he must have looked like an idiot with his mouth working open and shut at any and all words escaped him. Despite Todoroki's icy words, there was a calming warmth building up in Izuku's chest at the sheer protectiveness in his voice. It was the exact same tone the boy used back in that alleyway. Izuku tried to convince himself he didn't nearly like it as much as he did. It didn't work. You did hear, huh? He whispered, a breathless laugh tapering off at the end of his words. He looked at the ground for a moment, worrying at his bottom lip. He wasn't wrong though. He was completely wrong. Todoroki hissed with such conviction, such adamant belief that Izuku was having a hard time doubting him. Even when Izuku knew his father better than probably anyone else on this planet. You are the farthest thing from a villain. And you are definitely not your abusive asshole of a father. Stain only said those things to provoke a reaction out of you. There was no truth to any of those statements. Izuku's fists clenched at his side, his expression pinched as the words echoed in his head. I know that, he murmured, seeing more than feeling Todoroki take a few steps closer, Miss Fluffernugget jumping down from his hold. Izuku could only glue his focus to his friend's shoes as the pressure in his chest expanded, leaving him with a gentle fire spreading through his dry veins and shaking hands. I know that, but I do have an obsession with quirks, and I look at everyone and everything like it's some sort of puzzle that needs to be solved. Even if he was just trying to goad me into doing something stupid, he wasn't entirely wrong. Todoroki didn't say anything in his defense this time, didn't try to convince Izuku that he was wrong. Instead, he raised his left hand, slowly, as if he was afraid that Izuku would flinch away. He didn't feel the warmth that undoubtedly embraced Todoroki's hand as he cupped his jaw. His thumb brushed against the scar on his right cheek. Yet, he understood. He felt the lifeline that was being thrown out to him, to anchor him to the ground before he floated away. Somehow, that meant more to him than any verbal response. You, Todoroki breathed, speaking so softly that Izuku almost thought he was hallucinating, are the biggest hero fanatic that I have ever met. Izuku blinked in confusion, finally lifting his head so his attention was solely on the boy in front of him. That was not exactly where he thought this conversation would go, especially when his friend had seemed so ready to burn anyone who had hurt him down just mere seconds before. Yet now, his face held a peculiar softness that Izuku had never associated with Shouto Todoroki. Wah, you enjoy analyzing quirks because it makes you happy. And you are amazingly intelligent for being so concise and accurate with your observations. You genuinely love heroes, and that's why you watch them. Call it an obsession, or call it trying to put together a puzzle, but that's all you. Your father has no influence over the choices you make or the things you do today. You are not your father. Didn't you tell me something similar not too long ago? Izuku's jaw lamely dropped open, whatever protests he might have had dying on his tongue. He worked his mouth open and closed for several seconds for the second time since this conversation began, trying his chest to counter his argument because he knew that he was more like his father than he'd ever admit. Hisashi Midoriya had literally beaten his ideals into his son. Things like that didn't just disappear just because someone told you differently. But for a moment, a single moment, Izuku believed that Todoroki was right. Maybe he wasn't what his father made him to be. If that was the truth, Izuku would be okay with that. His forehead fell against Todoroki's chest, a small groan escaping his lips. That's unfair. He whined into the other's shirt, feeling the vibrations of Todoroki's quiet laughter against his skin. You weren't supposed to throw those words back at me when I'm full of self-deprecation. Todoroki's hand slipped from his cheek to the back of his neck, his fingers playing with the short hairs at his nape. His touch was soothing as he held Izuku close, but Izuku would never admit that to anyone but himself in the darkest hours of the night when he was alone. But then Todoroki grew oddly silent, and Izuku almost thought that he wasn't breathing. The air turned disturbingly pensive, the light, airy mood that his words had formed slowly growing darker, heavier. I have never seen you angry before. Izuku's eyes fluttered halfway shut, shame burning in his stomach. He was sure that if he could blush, his face would be as red as a tomato right about now. He had never been one to get angry. Not when he was alive, not now that he was dead. He had learned that rage solved nothing in the end. It simply made matters worse in the long run. Back then, in that alleyway, he couldn't stop himself, even if he knew it was wrong. Things were a little stressful back there, he explained, his hand coming up to grab a fistful of Todoroki's shirt. He didn't seem to mind the action too much. You or Iida could have been seriously hurt. And all you were telling me to do was leave. Todoroki hummed, pulling away enough to look down at Izuku's face. I didn't want you to get hurt, and fighting Stain was the exact opposite way of accomplishing that, he said, his body tensing as he uttered the vigilante's name. A grimace crossed his features, his lips pursing in disgust. You don't have to worry about me, Todoroki, Izuku breathed, feeling as though he could drown any second beneath the waves of emotion that were crashing around him. It had been such a long time since he had felt so much, and he wondered if it was because it was Todoroki there with him or not. A shadow of something flashed across his face, Todoroki's heterochromatic eyes narrowing the slightest fraction. Deku, why were you in Hosu? Izuku smiled, but it felt pathetic and weak on his lips. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Todoroki only shook his head, the sunlight dancing on his pale skin and hair. In any other situation, Izuku might have thought that he looked absolutely ethereal like that. That's not it, he muttered, his stare gliding down Izuku's body with a calculative glimmer in his irises. But it's a start, Izuku sighed. He could almost feel the exhaustion weighing down on his bones. But of course, there was none actually there. I can't give you all the details, he stated. And Todoroki nodded once in confirmation that he understood. Izuku gritted his teeth, preparing the words in his throat. He couldn't look Todoroki in the eye as he spoke fragments of the truth. Not now. I was asked to go to Hosu to ensure that Iida didn't get himself killed should he encounter Stain. Silence. Did you know that Iida was going to get hurt? He questioned, his voice losing some of the warmth from before. His hand stilled with his ministrations on the back of Izuku's neck, and Izuku wished he could disappear all over again. No. Did you know that Iida wanted to go after Stain? Izuku hesitated, and that was answer enough. Yes. Todoroki's arms grew taut around him, and Izuku was in the process of pulling away when he was suddenly jerked back towards Todoroki's chest. He felt a small weight pressing down on his curls as Todoroki delicately tucked Izuku's head beneath his chin. He couldn't see what expression the boy wore, if he was betrayed or hurt or anything in between. Izuku couldn't tell. You pushed me out of the way when Stain threw that blade at me, he hissed, pained in a way Izuku had never heard before. Even when he had spilled his horrid past to him, Todoroki had never quite sounded like this. I had to watch as you saved me, as you took the hit for me. Yet, you pulled the blade out, and you were completely fine. There wasn't even any blood. That couldn't have been a part of your quirk, right? Izuku didn't move as the world he had built slowly crumbled around him. He was helpless as he watched as fractions were obliterated into little more than dust and smoke. All previous resolve came tumbling down in the ruins of destruction. There was only so much that could be destroyed before the truth became apparent, and that point was approaching rather quickly. Izuku wished that it would never come, that what they had right now could be the truth, but it wasn't, it couldn't. Maybe he should have felt scared, but he didn't. All he felt in that moment was terribly sad. It's my body. It's complicated. Todoroki buried his face in his green curls. Are you okay? It wasn't hard for Izuku to shake his head. When Todoroki didn't say anything else after a long moment, Izuku finally worked up the nerve to pull away, slowly, hesitantly. Even though he couldn't feel warmth or the cold anymore, he could imagine his body shivering at the loss of contact. Todoroki's arms fell back to his sides. And if Izuku was an optimist like he once was, he would think that he was hesitant to let go too, maybe even dejected. But he wasn't, and anything more than the friendship they had would be impossible and self-destructive for both of them. Especially with recent developments, Izuku couldn't determine if Todoroki had figured it out yet. It certainly wasn't a conclusion that most would come to seriously. Maybe as some sort of joke, a fleeting musing, because it shouldn't have been possible. Even Izuku had had a difficult time understanding his own situation in the very beginning. It had taken months of loneliness and silence for him to even begin to comprehend his new reality. He could only imagine what Todoroki would think if he found out, if he had come to that conclusion. The proof was all there, hidden beneath subtlety and evasive behavior. Izuku. His head shot up at the use of his first name, his real name, only for lips to crash into his own. Izuku instantly froze at the unexpected, but not entirely unwelcomed. His mind added, contact. Todoroki's hands had moved to cup his face, and Izuku could feel them shaking against his skin. It was a strange feeling, seeing the confident, seemingly indifferent, Shadow Todoroki trembling with nerves. Despite the initial shock, it didn't take him long to kiss back. He knew that it was a bad idea, that he had to push Todoroki away, but damn, it was hard. Izuku had exactly zero experience with these types of things, but he knew that it wasn't a perfect kiss. He was sure that Todoroki's lips were warm and soft, but the feeling was lost on Izuku's skin. He wouldn't have been surprised if this was both their first kiss, because it was definitely Izuku's. It wasn't a Movisk perfect kiss most teenagers daydreamed about, but Izuku still loved the feeling. His hands rose to rest themselves on Todoroki's hips, unconsciously tugging him closer. He made a little noise of surprise, as though he hadn't expected Izuku to reciprocate the action at all before his lips began to move. Izuku was glad to follow suit. Izuku really wished he could still have been an optimist. He wished he could just kiss Todoroki and hope for a future where they both could be happy with whatever came next. He wished he could have a future where he could tell Todoroki everything about himself and everything could be alright. But everything wasn't alright. Everything was crashing down around him, and he was taking refuge in a place he felt safe, the lake, with Todoroki at his side. Here, no monsters or villains or vigilantes mattered. He could stay here for a small eternity, unchanging. But at least he was protected in a layer of bliss and childlike joy. Maybe if he was an optimist, he would be okay. But Aizawa was beginning to rub off on him. But he still really liked kissing Todoroki. A meow broke the spell, and Todoroki pulled away, a small laugh on his lips. Miss Fluffernugget was rubbing against his legs, hissing aggressively at any movement Izuku made. Todoroki rested his forehead against his eyes gently shut. "Please, never be so reckless again," he whispered breathily. And it took Izuku a moment to realize he was talking about Stain. He licked his lips shyly, letting his eyes fall shut as well. Maybe, no, this would never work out well. But there was still a part, no matter how small, that was saying that no matter how this ended, it would be fine. Another voice was telling him to stop being a naive idiot. He was going to disappear soon. But Izuku Midoriya was always known for his optimism in every situation. Okay. Also, Todoroki began abruptly, a strange, and dare he say mischievous, note hanging on his words. "I would like to apologize in advance, but I feel this is absolutely necessary and well-deserved." Izuku's eyes snapped open. Wah! Before he could comprehend what was happening, Izuku was falling sideways towards the water. He may or may not have let out a surprised, and slightly terrified, squeak as his arms pinwheeled, trying to regain his hopelessly lost balance. The next thing he knew, he was sitting in the shallow part of the lake with Todoroki hovering over him, a bright smile on the boy's lips. It was different from the small quirks of his lips that Izuku had seen before. This was bigger, free, beautiful. Izuku laughed with him. His trip back home was silent. The discoveries that he had learned earlier that day were circling around his head until he could no longer avoid confronting them. Nausea boiled in his stomach as the memory of the pictures unwillingly resurfaced at the forefront of his mind. He had seen some disturbing and sickening things in the years he'd been a hero, but nothing quite like this. Missing people didn't turn up as deformed monstrosities across Japan. Buried corpses of children no older than his students, didn't just vanish from their graves. He had never been burdened with the knowledge that that child was going to be turned into a mindless monster, a doll, for others to utilize as a weapon. But that was back then, and this is now. Now, he had to explain to the ghost of a teenage boy what the police had found and their theories regarding the evidence. He was barely even a teenager. He was 15, for God's sake. Shouta didn't know how he was going to tell a child that their body was stolen for experimental purposes, that there were many other missing people's corpses that had popped up randomly around the nation, and the next one might just be his own. How was he going to tell Izuku that there was even a possibility that his father had willingly offered up his son's corpse to become a Namu? There was no training, no course, no lecture he could have taken or listened to that would prepare him for this fucked up situation. Shouta knew how to calm down hysterical civilians as a pro hero. He knew how to deal with traumatized children and teens and adults during times of crisis. He had been trained to be able to talk down people moments away from suicide. There were actual courses that were required for all heroes in training for when they were handling victims of sexual assault, abuse, neglect, anything, everything. But being forced to tell Izuku, who had been acting strangely for a while, that his body was going to be turned into a monster was a situation that Shouta had not even the slightest of clues on how to approach, especially since Izuku seemed to have been acting more conservative as of late, quieter, more withdrawn. Shouta hadn't been at the apartment recently since the investigation began. But he wasn't stupid enough not to notice that something was bothering the kid. It was obvious in the way that he remained huddled on the couch, ever the frozen statue of uneasiness and anxiety for what might have been days on end. Shouta might not have had been around, but he had seen enough to know that, for whatever reason, Izuku was closing himself off. Shouta was barely even able to get him to speak when he came home after, apparently, battling Stain. Every explanation was short, clipped, so very much unlike his normal self that a spike of fear had embedded itself into the back of Shouta's mind. The underground hero shook his head as he neared his apartment complex, trying to ignore the thoughts flooding his consciousness. He was completely unsuccessful in his attempts, but he still made an effort, plus ultra or whatever other bullshit excuse he could come up with. When the building was in sight, he sighed in relief. He was about to cross the street to get to his complex when movement on the rooftop caught his attention. It was little more than a blur of color, but his eyes still snapped upward. A shadow paced on the roof, far too close to the edge for Shouta's comfort. Their movements were tense, erratic, as though they were in a panic. That's all he needed to see before he rushed towards the fire escape that climbed alongside the building. Forcing his steps to be silent as to not alert or frighten whoever was up there, he launched himself up the rusty, metal staircase. Using his capture scarf to ascend faster, he hoped that by the time he got up to the roof, it wouldn't be too late. This wasn't the first time he had been in a situation such as this one. He had witnessed both successes and failures. Shouta nearly threw himself onto the rough concrete of the rooftop, almost wishing that Hisashi was here as well. He was more skilled with talking to people than Shouta had ever been, but he could still manage on his own. There were more important things at stake right now than his own social inabilities. But when he actually took a look at the person furiously pacing the roof's edge, he was met with a head of familiar, green hair and wild eyes. Yet, at the same time, there was something unfamiliar about the boy that Shouta had never expected to see from the normally composed, at least emotionally, problem child. Izuku looked downright flustered. He wasn't blushing. Shouta wasn't even sure if that was possible, but occasionally, his scarred hands would scrub at his freckled cheeks as if he actually was. He was muttering, the words escaping his lips in jumbled heaps of incomprehensible nonsense that Shouta doubted even the kid himself could understand. Problem child, Shouta breathed, deflating a bit as the tension dissipated. His relief was quickly replaced with worry when Izuku's head whipped in his direction. If he could have, Shouta was positive that Izuku would have broken his neck at the speed at which he moved. His eyes were impossibly wide like a small toddler who was caught with their hand rummaging around the inside of a cookie jar. But as suddenly as the cautious wariness painting the boy's expression emerged, it vanished. In its place was a small, almost bashful grin. Aizawa, Izuku drawled, a nervous chuckle lacing his words. Fancy seeing you up here, Shouta groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose between his thumb and pointer finger. I saw someone on the roof, he explained, slowly approaching the source of his stress by the edge of the building. Izuku was probably causing him more gray hairs than a majority of his students, which was a difficult task to accomplish. Shouta might have been proud if it wasn't his health and sanity on the line. You almost gave me a heart attack. Izuku's smile brightened, a teasing glow curling his lips upward a fraction more. It wouldn't be the first time, he mused in a sing-song voice. Shouta shot him a glare with no real heat behind it, and the ghost winked in response. Literally winked. The light-hearted mood only lasted for that split second though. It wasn't long after that shadows consumed Izuku's face. The sudden shift made Shouta's stomach twist with nerves. Did you think I was trying to jump? Shouta blinked, meeting the boy's stare with his usual indifference despite his unease. I didn't know it was you, problem child, he insisted, crossing his arms over his chest. I just saw someone frantically pacing up here. Better safe than sorry. Izuku studied him with an unreadable glint in his pupils before nodding once. He turned away, muttering something under his breath that Shouta didn't catch as he turned his attention towards the city before him. I wasn't frantic, he grumbled, a little bit louder, which made Shouta wonder if that was purposeful, if Izuku wanted him to only hear that part. Knowing him, most likely. Shouta huffed a laugh. His voice was practically dripping in disbelief and sarcasm, which was not lost to the teenager judging by the way his mouth drooped into a pout. "So, what are you doing up here? Scheming or enjoying the view?" "Oh, no," Izuku scoffed, shaking his head as though Shouta had proposed the stupidest idea he'd ever heard. "I'm afraid of heights." Shouta frowned. "Then why are you on a roof?" The kid made a noise that distantly reminded Shouta of when one of his cats was choking on a hairball. His head twisted back to face the adult once again. Pout still going strong. "Because, Aizawa, I'm having an existential crisis." He yelped so abruptly that the underground hero had to repress a flinch. The boy's voice had raised about an octave or two, more like 10 actually, above normal in his moment of distress. "Oh?" he queried, still recovering from Problem Child's little, uncharacteristic outburst. The boy nodded violently, resuming his pacing once again, but this time with wild, animated arm movements. His fingers curled in his hair, pulling at green strands, his attention bouncing everywhere but Shouta. The next moment his arms waved through the air, covering his face as if to hide from the world and whatever reality was replaying in his memories. "Not frantic, my ass." "Yes, you know what's the worst thing to realize when you're already dead?" he demanded, flinging his arms out in a wide gesture that was reminiscent of every young, awkward teenager in history. Shouta opened his mouth to answer, but apparently Izuku wasn't actually searching for one. "Et or gay. Like, hey, my socially inept self likes boys. Let's find a nice, meaningful relationship. Oh wait, guess what? I'm a ghost, and there are probably 100 movies explaining why dating a dead person is an awful idea." Shouta knew that if Izuku could still breathe that he'd be huffing, his face red with lack of oxygen at the end of his tirade. Yet, his face remained in its pale, panicked expression, his words only increasing in volume the more he spoke. It made him seem so normal. If one subtracted out the words about his death, it would seem like he was just like any other confused teenager, ranting about a crush. Like his biggest worries in life were schoolwork and making friends and learning how to deal with awkward interactions with the person he liked. It was so mundane compared to the last few weeks with Izuku that Shouta didn't quite believe how this conversation was turning out. It was a bittersweet feeling to see Izuku like this, though. And then he remembered the reality of the situation and he was forcibly extracted from his little fantasy. Until he was back on the roof instead of lost inside his unrealistic musing. Namu. This child is going to become a Namu, monster for villains. He couldn't bring himself to erase the dread choking him when he placed his hand on top of Izuku's head, ruffling his curls gently with more care than one would probably associate with the underground hero. Izuku froze at the touch, staring up at Shouta with curious eyes. The hero could both feel and see his joints locking up, almost robotically. The pure confusion that emanated from the boy as if he was unaccustomed to any sort of physical contact that wasn't a direct attack stabbed at Shouta's heart. The fact that it was too late to do anything about it haunted his thoughts for a long while after. "You really are a problem child, huh?" The boy's eyebrows knitted together, seeming to dissect everything about this particular interaction for a long moment. Then Izuku snorted, his expression easing into something soft before waving Shouta's hand away. He placed his fists proudly on his hips, mocking a stereotypical hero's pose. "I try my best, mister. I don't have a boyfriend." Shouta instinctively recoiled. For the last time, Hisashi isn't my boy. He cut himself off, realizing his mistake a moment too late. Izuku's entire being radiated with triumph, his smile turning smug. "I never said anything about Yamada," he pointed out as if Shouta hadn't already known that. The victorious aura that surrounded him was suffocating and made Shouta want to bang his head into a wall due to his sheer stupidity. "Funny you should mention him though, don't you think, Aizawa?" He felt heat creeping up his neck before shoving it back down. He was not a flustered teenager. He was not Izuku. "Shut up, problem child," he grunted, hiding the lower part of his face in the folds of his capture scarf. Izuku purred, leaning forward eagerly. "You didn't deny it. We aren't dating, engaged, no, secretly married." "No," Shouta hissed, his voice a low rumble. "Where are you getting these ideas from?" Izuku frowned, his gaze dropping to the ground, looking rather unperturbed for someone who was consecutively shot down so many times. "I thought not," he muttered, tapping his chin with his fingertips. Shouta's question, when ignored as thousands of thoughts danced in the boy's mind. Sometimes, Shouta wished he could see what was going on inside that kid's head. But then he would realize that not even the kid knew a majority of the time. Suddenly, his emerald eyes widened comically. "What?" he demanded, not liking how silent Izuku had become in the last few moments. Quiet was never a good sign when it came to problem children. It meant they were thinking, and when they were thinking, it usually resulted in Aizawa's mental demise. "How could I have not come to this conclusion sooner? All the evidence has been right under my nose this entire time," he gasped, running his hands through his hair in shocked awe. Shouta actively acknowledged that Izuku was a little troublemaker, emphasis on the little part, but he had never seen that glimmer illuminating his face before. He could practically feel the gray hairs coming in now. "What are you going on about?" You're friends with benefits. Shouta choked. All inward thoughts stumbled to a raging halt as he felt his heart still in his chest. This was the second goddamn time, since Shouta had known the boy that he almost gave the underground hero a heart attack. It was purposeful, and they both were well aware of that fact. Izuku was going to be the death of him one way or another if he kept up this track record. Do you even know what that means? Another snort came from Izuku, seeming ever the annoyed teenager. Obviously, he said, drawing out each syllable of the word as if for Shouta's benefit. I'm 15, not oblivious. Izashi and I aren't. You guys are friends, yes. Izuku interrupted for what must have been the billionth time since this cursed conversation began. Shouta had a sudden, okay, definitely not so sudden, urge to strangle the ghost with his capture gear. It was a recurring desire that he had often stomped down out of the kindness of his crippled heart. And the only reason why he hadn't attempted so far once that kindness sputtered out was because he knew that Izuku was a slippery one. He could probably escape just as easily as Shouta could capture him. Yes, and you guys regularly have sex. I don't see how I'm incorrect. Izuku challenged, bluntly, shrugging his shoulders far too innocently for their conversation topic. Maybe Shouta didn't have to strangle him. Maybe he could just beat him over the head with a stick until he finally knocked some common sense into the boy. Maybe then he could finally escape this topic with his sanity intact and pretend this never happened. It was such a pleasant dream. I am not talking about my sex life with you. He knew his face was probably bright red by now, and Izuku was able to see that as well. Shouta could tell how pleased the boy was with his deductions. That's it. Izuku Midoriya was killing him and enjoying every moment of it. He always knew that the boy had a sadistic side to him, no matter how sweet and kind he may have acted in the past. Shouta groaned, hoping that his soul would leave with his breath. The feet hung heavily on his back, only increasing his exhaustion as his body slumped tiredly. It's not like that, he insisted, moving to sit on the lip of the roof, letting his feet dangle in the air. Izuku's brow furrowed, confusion carving a scowl upon his pallid face. He quickly followed suit, his arm brushing against Shouta's as he took the spot next to the underground hero. All the teasing was instantly gone from his expression. It's not that. Superficial. Out of the corner of his vision, Izuku nodded. Yet the cloudiness did not clear from his features. It was like the boy was constructing a puzzle, but some pieces were missing or didn't quite fit correctly. So, you care about him as more than a friend. And you do things that friends typically wouldn't, but there's no title to it. There's no formal attachment. Leave it to a child to put it so honestly. We're both heroes, he explained, looking out over the city. The sun was high in the sky since it was still early afternoon, and not a single cloud obstructed the bright blue hanging above them. The scent of something unidentifiably sweet lingered in the air, swirling around them in the gentle breeze. It may have come from one of the surrounding buildings or maybe one of the apartments below them. Shouta couldn't tell. We face danger and every day. If it was known that we were in a relationship, then it could be used against us. I have a lot of enemies, both as an underground hero and as the teacher of 1A. But that's not the real reason, is it? Izuku guessed, switching his concentration to the horizon that was filled to the brim with bustling life. People walked along the sidewalks, traveling to the train station for work or perhaps to visit someone somewhere that was not here. It didn't seem to matter to Izuku, as long as they could act as a distraction from this sensitive and vulnerable topic for a short while. Whether that was for his or Shouta's sake, he didn't know. If it was, you could just hide your relationship, keep it a secret. That's not what you're doing now. You're not acknowledging that there even is a relationship beyond friendship. Shouta scratched at the thin scar beneath his eye from the USJ, wondering how someone so young could be so insightful. Problem Child had always been different from other kids, and it was like a breath of fresh air for Shouta. His views were probably assembled from an outside perspective on the situation rather than pure childish naivety that the underground hero would expect from his students. He would never dare call the child naive. Not when he'd been through so much, seen so much in the last few weeks. Either of us could die at any time. It's just easier to accept if we don't put a label on our relationship so that we won't leave the other one hanging should we be killed. It would hurt worse if we allow anything more than what we have to grow. Shouta acquiesced, feeling a small pang echo in his chest. He was well aware of how ignorant he sounded, how childish and hopeful. Yet, at the same time, it made almost perfect sense to him and Hisashi. After recovering from the loss of one of their friends back in high school, it was obvious to both of them that neither wanted to go through that kind of pain again. It only seemed right to continue on as they had, even if things had visibly changed between them. Does that make sense now, Problem Child? Izuku merely made a small noise in the back of his throat. Despite the kid not having physically changed a bit since they had first met, Shouta couldn't help but notice that the boy seemed to age well beyond his years, if that was even possible. He seemed contemplative, but there was a darkness beneath the calculative light that Shouta knew all too well. It was like the puzzle pieces had shifted to form a new picture, but there was still one piece missing. No, he answered sincerely. his fingers tapping out an unfamiliar song on his thighs. A nervous tick, perhaps, or maybe even an unconscious action. It sounds like you're running away because you're scared of pain. It will all hurt the same in the end when one of you dies, regardless of what you call each other now. Shouta's silence persisted for a few heartbeats as he mulled over his words. It does seem a little ridiculous, doesn't it? The boy swung his feet in the air lazily, leaning back on his hands, his vibrant red shoes nearly glowing in the sunlight. I guess I don't really understand, but I suppose that's to be expected. We don't share the same experiences, so it's only natural we would view things differently. Shouta recognized the real meaning behind those words. It was painfully clear to him. Izuku had died. He had lost everything before his life had even started to begin. He possessed a perspective that Shouta didn't and wouldn't until the day he died as well. But even then, Shouta wasn't a child like Izuku was. He had had the chance to go to high school, to graduate, to get a job. He was able to grow up into a self-sufficient adult. Izuku hadn't. Curiosity loosened the underground hero's tongue. What would you do in my shoes? A minute smile crept up the boy's lips, a small beacon of light in the hopelessness that seemed content to entangle itself with him. Do you know what the most valuable thing in this world is, Aizawa? Izuku inquired, softly, dark laughter erupting from his mouth as though there was some sort of inside joke that Shouta wasn't aware of. The hero's brow furrowed, glancing at the boy with something akin to concern. When he shook his head, the boy's smile expanded. It's different for every person, but you'll find out what it was when you lose it. Shouta didn't know what he was expecting, but it certainly wasn't that. Those didn't sound like the words of a 15-year-old. Have you lost yours yet? He asked gruffly. Izuku seemed to honestly consider his question for a moment. He played with different answers that held a variety of truths until he found one that held the most, or the least, amount of honesty he was capable of now. It was a long while before he spoke again, but Shouta was glad he did. I don't think so, or at least, if I did, it wasn't actually all that important in the first place. He sighed, seeming disappointed with himself for a reason Shouta couldn't comprehend. But that wasn't why I asked you that. Then why did you? Izuku examined his hands, scarred and fingers a little crooked. They were still permanently frozen in time. If I were in your shoes, I'd be selfish. If I had a relationship with someone, I'd cherish it for as long as I was able to, no matter how short it may be, he stated with absolute certainty and conviction. His voice took on a lonely tune, and it only served to remind Shouta of how young Izuku Midoriya truly was, of how much he missed out on. You see, Aizawa, back when I was still alive, I was quirkless. In fact, I was the only quirkless person at school, elementary and middle. So, you know how it goes. My father left because he didn't want a useless son. My mom became depressed because I was depressed. I was bullied by my classmates. My friends turned against me. And all my teachers just stood back and watched because I was just a troublesome kid who got into fights all the time. It's basically taboo to help or befriend a quirkless person these days, especially when they're a kid. Or maybe it was just me. I never wanted to know the answer to that, I guess. But I knew I was alone. I knew that no one would be my friend. And my mom was working multiple jobs to support us. So, if I were in your shoes, I'd make a lot of friends. And if there was someone who liked me and I liked them, I'd date them if that's what we both wanted. I'd make sure I was never alone because being lonely is worse than being dead. Izuku paused, emerald green peeking out from beneath lowered lashes. But that's my answer based on my experiences. You have different values than I do. Shouta felt fury bubbling in his stomach and had to literally bite his tongue to keep from demanding who these people were. No one deserved to be isolated for something so trivial and out of their control. How could people, adults, teachers, abandon a child, throw them to the wolves and watch them be devoured so mercilessly? How could they have blamed the victim for instigating the fight? He was livid, but the worst part about it all was that it was too late. There was nothing he could do to help Izuku now. He couldn't confront the students and teachers. Nothing would come out of it. It was too late. Too late to convince Izuku that it didn't matter if he was quirkless and that he shouldn't let it crush whatever dreams he may have had. And that was so frustrating. Shouta patted Izuku's head once more, suffocating the fire burning in his body before it could fester for too long. He couldn't do anything to fix the past, but he could ensure that the kid realized that he wasn't alone right now. You didn't deserve to be treated like that, kid. But I understand what you're telling me, he whispered quietly. He didn't look Izuku's way, but he could feel the boy's wary gaze tearing a hole in the side of his skull. It was as though he was searching for any trace of a lie that didn't exist because Shouta had spoken the truth, even if Izuku didn't quite believe it himself. Thanks, Izuku giggled, hiding his mouth behind slightly crooked fingers as his alertness melted away. Anytime, he chuckled, the delight in his voice almost bringing a smile to Shouta's face. Almost, he would never admit that, ever. Problem children couldn't be indulged like that or else they'd keep coming back like stray cats after you fed them. And it's okay. It was only to be expected. I was different, and people don't like different. That doesn't condone what they did. The boy stood up then, his movements slow as though he was on autopilot. He stretched his arms above him, and he let out a small, content noise once he was satisfied. It seemed more out of habit than to genuinely stretch, but Shouta didn't mention that observation. Izuku's eyes trailed across an invisible line that the hero couldn't follow, an almost nostalgic air taking over his features. There was another moment of quiet consideration before his green irises fell to the cement stories beneath them. I'm no longer afraid of heights now, so something good came out of it, I suppose, he sighed, his tone weak, soft. The seemingly random words chilled Shouta's blood in his veins. Nothing about his expression or body language gave any indication of what he meant or why he said them. But I still really hate roofs. Shouta observed him from where he was still seated as the boy shoved his hands in his pockets. He couldn't help but wonder if this was how Izuku acted when he was still alive. If he was always so openly analytical and muttered beneath his breath. He doubted that Izuku had spoken this truthfully about his problems and bullying to anyone back then, considering what he had just admitted not too long ago. It was either that or he had told people, and they never believed him. The answer was that Shouta didn't know. He probably would never know or ask. He seemed like such an ordinary kid, yet, at the same time, Shouta knew that Izuku was far more different from anyone else he'd ever met. He's going to be turned into a Namo. The thought burned away at his pleasant wonderings, obliterating whatever light atmosphere may have been produced. He still had to tell him, Midoriya, there's something we need to talk about. The kid hesitated, seeming to hear the solemn note in his voice, slowly lowering his arms back down to his sides. His throat bobbed nervously, but his expression did not change the slightest bit. Is about what you found out from Detective Tsukachi. When Shouta nodded, Izuku didn't seem shocked or eager to find out the information. His face was slack, calm, too calm. It was like he was completely shut down, apathetic. Shouta had seen that same look on hardened criminals and heroes alike, but never on a child. Is it all right if we do this now? It can wait. Izuku wrapped his arms around himself, spun on his heel away from the edge, and walked somberly towards the center of the roof. His back was facing Shouta the entire time. But he caught the small nod from the boy, so he explained, the missing people, the mutilated corpses, the experiments, the namofication, everything. Not once did Izuku make a peep, no matter how gory the detail was. Shouta didn't bother to sugarcoat anything. It wouldn't help Izuku, and he didn't want to give the boy false hope that things might turn out all right in the end. Izuku remained dutifully mute through it all. He was tortuously still, and Shouta once again noticed that Izuku didn't need to breathe anymore. The calmness worried him. Izuku asked questions, he formulated theories. There was always a verbal thought process being heard no matter how obscure it was to others. He should have been muttering to himself, his eyes igniting with curiosity. Izuku should have been swaying with his words, pacing, tapping his chin, scratching his cheek, something. This stillness didn't suit him. This silence didn't suit him. Yet, it's what Shouta received. When he was finished, Izuku didn't say a word. He didn't move a muscle, didn't breathe, didn't change. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets, facing the fire escape. Shouta couldn't see his face, just the back of wild, untamable curls. Just as he was about to rise to his feet, Izuku spoke, his speech slow, uncaring. So my corpse is being used as a doll to see how many quirks it takes to stuff a dead body to make it a toy soldier, he stated. There was no hint of an inquiry to be heard, just a declaration. The small laugh that followed rang hollow like a bell without its clapper. The irony is killing me. Shouta was sure he wasn't supposed to hear that last part, but it still made its way to his ears. Izuku sounded far too composed, too unnaturally calm given the circumstances. Shouta would have preferred a mental breakdown, fear, screaming even, anything but the lack of interest and apathy that engulfed the usually overly expressive boy. Midoriya, you know, it could be worse, he proceeded as though Shouta hadn't spoken at all. The light, vaguely jovial way he talked sent off dozens of alarms in Shouta's brain. His gut was screaming at him. If he didn't stop Izuku, if he didn't help him, if he let him go, something bad would happen. If he didn't convince him right now to stay and talk it out, there's always a way any situation could be worse. I make it a habit to look on the bright side of things, even when there doesn't seem to be any. Optimism at its finest. Yeah. Are you all right, Midoriya? He asked, pulling himself off the ground. This finally seemed to get a physical reaction out of the kid. He cocked his head pensively before stealing a glance over his shoulder at Shouta. He absolutely detested the look of troubled bewilderment marring his features. I'm not flickering or bleeding anywhere, so I must be, he said, shrugging his thin shoulders. He quickly turned back away, resuming his stroll to the fire escape. His steps were careful and deliberate as if it was simply a leisurely walk. Just when he got to the opposite end of the apartment's roof, he halted once more. Do you want to know why I'm not afraid of heights anymore, Aizawa? Shouta's jaw clicked when he snapped it shut. He wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer, but he could already guess it. Not waiting for a response, Izuku pushed forward. I died in a fall. It was an accident really, he hummed, and Shouta hoped that the lighthearted edge was fake. Well, technically, I guess I died in the ambulance ride to the hospital. But who's really paying attention to the little details? 5 stories and a solid concrete landing later, and I don't really see the point in being afraid of heights or much else for that matter. I can't die twice after all. With that, Izuku skipped down the fire escape, his green hair fading from view. Shouta was rooted to the roof, body swaying. If he found it hard to breathe, that was his own business. He wasn't sure how long he stood on top of that roof, staring after his problem child. It may have been seconds, maybe minutes, probably hours, but it all felt like days. There was just so much to unpack in that short conversation they just shared, much more with Izuku's reaction to every subject. But eventually, his phone buzzed in his pocket and Shouta picked it up without looking at the caller ID. He barely noticed that it was his work phone, not his personal. Eraserhead, we have a problem, Detective Tsukachi started, jarring Shouta out of his stupor. The pure, almost fearful, urgency in the man's tone was something the underground hero wasn't familiar with. Shaking all previous thoughts from his head, Shouta made his way towards the fire escape where Izuku had gone down not so long ago. What is it? He asked, trying to keep both the exhaustion and apprehension out of his words. For a moment, the only sound was the metallic clink of Shouta's feet as he descended the stairs with just as much purpose as when he first ascended it. DNA testing came back on Izuku Midoriya's coffin, Tsukachi stated, and Shouta could practically see his tense shoulders as he sat in his office looking over the case's files. Shouta's eyes narrowed. What about it? We already confirmed that it was Dragon that took his body. That's just the thing. Reports came back with Dragon's DNA all over the coffin. Shouta stopped on the stairs, his grip tightening on his phone. If he was in the right state of mind, he would have been astounded that the screen didn't instantly crack. Isn't that the point? Why would that be a problem? He demanded. Tsukachi took an audible breath. Normally, it wouldn't be, but as was the only DNA we found. Shouta swallowed against the lump forming in his throat. What are you saying? He spat, clenching his jaw until it ached. There was not a trace of Izuku's DNA anywhere at the scene, which should be virtually impossible. The kid's been dead for almost 9 months. His DNA should be everywhere in that coffin, but there's none. That can't be possible. A quiet rustling of papers was his only immediate response, filled Shouta's stomach with a churning dread he wished he could just ignore. He had a closed casket funeral. Shouta felt his heart stop, the implications threatening to drown him. His body might not have been in that coffin, he mumbled, running a hand through his hair, tempted to rip strands out in frustration. That could mean any number of things. Izuku's body could have been anywhere. It might not have been the League who possessed it now. And if that was the case, then what was the point of Dragon digging up his son's grave to unearth Izuku's coffin? What was actually inside this entire time? It would appear not, Tsukachi informed, the sound him anxiously reorganizing the files and papers crackling on the other end of his phone. There isn't anything we can do until more tests come back, but I needed to pass this information along. Shouta thanked the man and promptly hung up. Fuck,